man had been dead for 3 days, and then, without warning, he came back to life. He found himself transformed into a hideous, terrifying monster. People even gave him an honorable title, the Zombie Knight, for their ruler had long since surrendered to the vampires. Humanity had no choice but to pin all their remaining hope on him. A blood-red sun cast its dying light across the bodies on the battlefield. The last few survivors had been driven to the edge of a cliff, with nowhere left to run. 2 vampires watched as though savoring the humans' desperate final struggle. They traded mocking remarks about how fragile human lives were. A woman pressed the children tightly behind her back. She screamed with all her voice that a hero was coming. The vampires acted as if they'd heard the most ridiculous jokes, sneering with contempt. They raised their blades and declared that this tedious little game was over. The last of the soldiers knew full well they were marching to their deaths, yet they charged forward with a furious battle cry. When one fell, another stepped in without a moment's hesitation, all to buy the women and children behind them a little more time. The vampires moved like lightning, flickering through the crowd in a blur. Every appearance brought with it another life extinguished. The last soldier fell. The vampires turned their gaze to the cowering woman and children. With rare mercy, one of them offered the promise of a relatively quick end. Just as the blade was about to fall, a deep, commanding voice rang out. Through the thick mist and smoke, a massive figure slowly emerged, clad in eerie armor that looked as though it had been forged from the bones of beasts. Each step fell heavy and deliberate. An aura of decay radiated from him, neither quite living nor quite dead, sending chills down the spine. The 2 vampires fixed their wary eyes on this uninvited intruder. There was no trace of life about him. He was like a walking corpse. Before they could make sense of it, the knight suddenly broke into a wild sprint. The vampires raised their swords to meet him, mocking him for overestimating himself. But in the next instant, a massive fist was already in their face. The long-haired vampire didn't even have time to cry out before being hammered straight into the ground. The other vampire went pale with shock. His eyes darted to the spot where the knight had launched himself, over 10 meters away. No human could ever possess that kind of strength and speed. The knight turned, his hollow helmet gazing toward the remaining prey. The short-haired vampire struck first. His blade shot out like a striking viper. It pierced the center of the knight's breastplate with perfect precision, right where the heart would be, a blow that should have been lethal. Yet the knight didn't so much as flinch. The vampire froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. His answer came in the form of the knight's gauntleted hand, slowly rising. That hand seized his skull with irresistible force, and lifted him off the ground as effortlessly as one would lift a child. The vampire thrashed and choked. The knight's other fist came crashing down into his body, and then the vampire stopped struggling entirely. The surviving woman and children had seen it all. The woman called out in a trembling voice, "Lord Hero!" The knight turned and asked whether there were other children who needed protection. He told them that 5 kilometers ahead lay what humans called their sacred refuge, but the woman was overcome with joy, convinced that the prophecy had finally come to pass. The word hero made the knight pause just for a moment. Then a low, strange laugh rumbled out from beneath his helmet. He walked slowly toward the woman and reached up to grip his helmet. Once removed, he asked whether he still looked like a hero now. The face beneath grinned in a grotesque, unsettling way. The joy on the woman's face froze in an instant, replaced by sheer terror. With the smile came movement, and one particular piece of him worked itself loose. His nose dropped to the ground and rolled across it a few times. The knight bent down casually to retrieve it, muttering that it had fallen off again. That sight finally shattered whatever nerve the survivors had left. They scrambled and stumbled over each other to get away. The knight picked up his nose and let out a quiet, amused chuckle. In this world where despair stretched endlessly, a rumor began to spread. They said there was an undying knight who wandered between the night and the bloodshed. He did not fight for humanity, yet he clashed with the vampires without end. Not long after, a group of people wearing bird-beak masks appeared. They stepped into a chamber strewn with corpses and found the knight, dead, but still standing. Someone confirmed in a trembling voice that this was the legendary warrior Gunther. 228 battles, all victories, no defeats. A record that ended only at the hands of the vampires. Even humanity's greatest swordsman could not overcome those inhuman beings. His companions felt uneasy about the plan they were about to carry out. But the girl named Arian held a steady gaze, determined to place her trust in it. They checked the state of the body and found the degree of decay to be acceptable. Arian slowly removed her mask, revealing a pale but resolute face. She said quietly that when the age calls for a hero does not truly fall. At that moment, Gunther's consciousness was lost inside a blood-soaked dream. Young and lean, he stood in a sea of blood and corpses, gasping for breath. A voice praised him for surviving once again, telling him he'd done well. But all the light had already gone out of his eyes, leaving only a hollow emptiness. Then, in the next instant, the blinding light of reality wrenched him back. Around him, cries of jubilation erupted, announcing that it had worked. Arian called his name urgently, asking if he was conscious. Gunther tried to make sense of things. He was certain he had died. Arian told him that for the sake of humanity, he had been given a second life. Those words made his pupils contract sharply. Just then, someone brought over a mirror. What he saw in it made him let out a low, broken growl. The body was covered in suture marks. All 4 limbs missing, suspended in midair. Arian immediately pushed back against his horror, insisting he was not a monster. Reiner added that as long as his brain remained intact, he could not truly die. Gunther forced himself to process this reality that defied all comprehension. Arian pointed to a set of specially crafted prosthetic limbs nearby, her voice filled with excitement. They would grant him dozens of times the strength of an ordinary human, enough to fight vampires. She was certain that with his abilities, he would surpass those inhuman creatures. Gunther understood the real reason they had brought him back. They wanted to mold him into a heroic puppet to fight for humanity. Arian spoke with growing intensity, recounting everything the vampires had taken from him. She pleaded with him to fight alongside them, for the very survival of the human race. Gunther closed his eyes as if giving the proposal serious thought. He asked Reiner to come closer, saying he had conditions to share in private. Reiner suspected nothing and assumed he had agreed. In the next second, Gunther clamped what remained of his thighs around Reiner's head in a vice-like grip. He told them to stop wasting words and release him immediately. Arian cried out Reiner's name but didn't dare to move. Gunther laughed with savage abandon. He had become the strongest because killing meant nothing to him. In his eyes, the selfishness and smallness of humans was no different from the vampires. He lived only for his own survival. Everyone else's fate was none of his concern. He threatened to crush Reiner's skull if they didn't detach his limbs and let him go. Under the pressure, Reiner's head began to deform as he let out agonized whimpers. Yet Arian watched him with a complicated expression. She slowly reached into her pocket and withdrew a pocket watch. Gunther sneered that she had the nerve to check the time at a moment like this. Arian calmly corrected him. It was Gunther's time that was running out. The moment the countdown ended, blood suddenly burst from Gunther's throat. His strength drained away like a receding tide, and he slackened his grip on Reiner. He lost consciousness. He didn't know how much time had passed when he jolted awake with a roar, but found himself still hanging in the same place. Reiner rubbed his aching jaw and told him to cause less trouble from now on. He explained that any movement required a source of power, and the force that drove his body was the life of a living person. Only then did Gunther notice a tube connecting him to Arian. Arian disconnected it to show him the truth. Once disconnected, he had only 2 hours of free movement. Gunther's fury ignited instantly. This was an absolutely absurd constraint. Reiner admitted he'd expected exactly this reaction, but there was no way around it. It was a plan that staked their very lives on keeping humanity alive. Someone like Arian, who had been implanted with the life device, was called a power host. Out of hundreds of volunteers, she was the only one who had survived the procedure. She would likely be the first and the last power host there would ever be. Reiner gave him a choice: hang there and die with the rest of humanity, or fight to protect Arian. Gunther was tormented by the decision, the silence stretching between them. Just as he was about to speak, a blood-curdling scream rang out from beyond the door. A team member came bursting in, his words cut off before he could finish. A hideous claw punched through him from behind, spraying blood. A vampire sneered and announced it had come on orders from above to take the beauty. Their greedy eyes swept the room as they let out grating, twisted laughs. The sudden, terrifying attack drained the color from every face. The team members looked to each other in panic, asking what to do. Gunther barked at them to attach his limbs. Reiner snapped to attention and ordered 2 team members outside to buy time. The 2 he named went white as sheets, convinced they were being sent to their deaths. Reiner refused to move himself, using his rank as an excuse. The situation fell into a desperate standstill as every second ticked away. Then Arian quietly tightened her grip on the crossbow in her hands. She stepped forward, deciding she would be the one to buy them time. Reiner panicked. Losing her meant losing their most critical asset. Gunther was even more furious, roaring that she had no business putting herself out there. But Arian had already turned, leveling her crossbow at the encroaching shadows. The 2 vampires laughed at her audacity. They declared arrogantly that they surpassed humans in every possible way. Their answer was a cold bolt slicing through the air. The tip aimed straight at the wide-eyed vampire's forehead, but the expected impact never came. He caught the arrowhead with his bare hand. Arian calmly knocked a second arrow. The vampire crushed the shaft. The second bolt flew, and he dodged it with unnatural ease. He closed the distance as he evaded, his movements ghost-like in their speed. Arian barely had time to react before a sharp, searing pain tore through her stomach. She was sent flying with a brutal kick. Her back slammed hard into the cold stone wall. Then an icy hand clamped around her vulnerable throat. The wide-eyed vampire leaned in to examine her, murmuring in admiration. He decided her face was beautiful enough to present to his superior as an offering. Hearing this, the one-eyed vampire immediately rushed over to claim her for himself. The 2 vampires actually broke into an argument right then and there over who she belonged to, just as they bared their fangs at each other. A furious roar came crashing down from above. Fully assembled, Gunther came barreling in and sent both monsters flying with a single kick. He quickly checked on Arian's injuries. Fortunately, nothing was serious. Gunther scolded her harshly, saying she'd lost her mind. If they were allies, she needed to value her life. Then an odd sound broke the air. The 2 vampires had started fighting and bickering with each other again. Watching their battered heads regenerate before his eyes, Gunther realized this would be tricky. Arian said they had to destroy the vampires' hearts. Before she'd even finished, the vampires lunged again. Gunther swept Arian behind him. The wide-eyed vampire stared at Gunther's face and froze, his face twisted into an expression of disbelieving terror, as if he'd seen a ghost. Gunther answered with a savage grin and a punch that caved the vampire's head in. Using the chaos, the one-eyed vampire charged toward toward Arian. His hand nearly reached her before Gunther cut him off just in time. The vampire was slammed into the ground with a heavy, dull crash. Reiner watched with his jaw hanging open, astonished by the sheer power of the modified body. But Arian noticed something else entirely. Gunther's strength was immense, but his speed had dropped. His movements were slightly sluggish. He was managing through tactics, not raw speed. She even noticed that he was deliberately avoiding the vampire's hearts. This man seemed to be savoring the torment he was inflicting. Gunther gripped the one-eyed vampire by the throat and pinned him against the wall. He was quite satisfied with his new body. The vampire trembled in terror, cursing that humans had gone and created a monster. Gunther smirked, saying that was hardly a worthy final statement. Just as he was about to finish it, the vampire stopped him. He claimed to have a proposal that would absolutely satisfy him. He announced that Lord Bonsar was nearby. If they were killed here, his lord would come for revenge within the hour. When that happened, no one in this room would last even a minute. Gunther couldn't understand why a lord would bother avenging his lackeys. The vampire shrieked passionately because Lord Bonsar loved them. In this world, only their lord had ever cherished them and shown them true affection. So, hand over the woman, and they would spare everyone else. Arian frowned. Gunther glanced back and said they could hand over the bald one. The vampire took one look at Reiner and refused flatly. He was far too ugly. Gunther's eyes went cold, and the negotiation collapsed in an instant. He drove his fist straight through the wide-eyed vampire's heart. Then, with the speed of a thunderclap, he finished off the one-eyed one. Even as he faded, the one-eyed vampire kept calling out over and over for Lord Bonsar. Gunther couldn't help but wonder what made them revere him so deeply. Arian explained that Bonsar was a higher vampire. Vampires were divided into three main ranks, each vastly different in power. At the pinnacle were the purebloods, born of nature itself. Those who had changed by drinking pure blood became the higher vampires. And these two had merely drunk the blood of a higher vampire. They were lesser ones. Higher vampires were rare, but their power defied imagination. Reiner came running over in a panic, warning that time was short. Bonsar would come within the hour. They had to prepare right away. Gunther doubted the vampire's word, but Reiner insisted they take precautions anyway. At that moment, Arian turned to Gunther with a solemn final question. She needed to know for certain whether he had truly decided to fight alongside them. Gunther was silent for a moment before giving his answer. To him, his own life would always come first. But given the current situation, working together seemed to be the only way to survive. He would temporarily join forces with them to face the threat ahead. Arian thanked him gravely, saying humanity would remember his choice. Then she said there was a gift for him. Soon after, Gunther was fitted with a set of specially crafted armor. Reiner marveled at how impressive it looked, calling it the attire of a hero. Gunther looked it over for a long moment and offered one short remark. He thought it was incredibly tacky. Arian explained that it had been specifically designed to work with his mechanical limbs. Since his speed wasn't enough to dodge attacks, it would minimize the damage he took. She also pointed out the red tube running along his wrist. After being disconnected, it would show how much free movement time he had left. As the red line shortened, time was running out. He needed to watch it constantly. Gunther said he understood, and the energy transfer began. 40 minutes later, something shifted. The ground shuddered with a violent tremor. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Something massive was approaching. Gunther immediately ordered the connection severed and demanded to know the way out. Arian told him they were in a repurposed underground crypt beneath the city. There was only one way in or out. Gunther tensed immediately, snapping that this was exactly the kind of information he should have known sooner. With time running out, he thought fast and pulled on his helmet. Then he ordered Arian harshly to stay behind him and not take matters into her own hands again. He held his breath, eyes locked on the single dark opening. But what emerged from it were three perfectly round, bald heads. Three delicate featured faces broke into vacant grins. The whole room went still. The three heads each spoke in turn, piecing together a chilling accusation. They accused the humans before them of killing their family. Gunther calmly confirmed he had taken care of them. Hearing this, the creature began to feign sympathy for humans. It mocked them for their ugly appearances, pitiful creatures too wretched to deserve love. Gunther found himself at a loss for words. He turned to Reiner and asked if this was actually the so-called Bonsar. Reiner steeled himself and stepped forward, attempting to reason with the creature. He argued that both sides had killed the other's people. Why not call it even? Bonsar burst out laughing. He said with apparent regret that he had made a vow to Julius, a vow to wipe out every last human being in the world. Gunther had expected as much, and the fire of battle lit in his eyes. He taunted that Bonsar probably couldn't handle him alone. Bonsar grinned wide at that, as if he'd heard something hilarious. In the next second, countless heads began to emerge from the darkness. He explained leisurely that lesser vampires were merely shields against the daylight. Once darkness fell, no one would be able to touch him. Then all the heads laughed in unison. There was no one who could destroy him. The sight of those tightly packed faces made every hair stand on end. Forcing back his revulsion, Gunther demanded to know what part of him was supposed to look like a vampire. Arian looked closely. She found that he had assembled his form by stitching faces together with blood. That was when Reiner finally understood the origin of his title, the Face Collector. Arian quickly reasoned that the heart must be hidden behind one of the faces. Before she'd finished, the massive column of faces came crashing down. At the last possible second, Gunther pulled her out of the way. He hadn't expected something so large to move so quickly. He told Arian to get back and stay far away, but Arian was anxious. Without finding his true core, there was no way to win. Gunther told her to stop worrying about useless things and focus on staying safe. Then Arian caught a glimpse of of what was happening on the other side. Countless faces were slowly creeping toward their companion in the birdbeak mask. They suddenly snapped their eyes open and bared their fangs. The person let out a shriek of terror. Gunther drove his fist in, shattering the leading faces. Bonsar turned his heads with curiosity, only to be met with an even fiercer punch. Gunther attacked like a man possessed. If he couldn't find the true core, then he would smash every single one of those revolting faces into nothing. Reiner stared in disbelief, convinced Gunther had completely lost it. But his power was actually a match for a higher vampire. They might actually win. Yet Arian felt a growing heaviness in her chest, with no sense of relief at all. As Gunther shattered face after face, the creature's voice rose in admiration. It marveled that such a powerful knight could exist among humans. Then it widened its countless eyes and posed a question. Was he truly still human? Gunther answered with a heavier fist, but in the next second, he froze. One of the faces bit down savagely on his arm, announcing its success. The nearby mouths immediately joined in, boasting of their crushing bite force. Once bitten, there would be no breaking free. Gunther reached with his other hand to pull free, but more faces latched on in an instant. They gnawed at his armor greedily, making sounds that set teeth on edge. In moments, all four of his limbs were bound by the writhing mass of faces. The situation had turned dire in an instant. One face lunged close to Gunther and opened a gaping maw. It would show him what truly lay within, the hell inside, and it swallowed Gunther whole. His mind drifted to his oldest memory, a garbage dump. Gunther had been abandoned there the day he was born. He had cried out for days and no one came. Eventually, even his voice gave out. Perhaps from that day on, he had stopped longing for someone to hold him. He trusted only his own strength. Gunther opened his eyes. Countless mouths gnawed at his limbs, sending waves of tearing agony through him. Against 2 or 3 faces, he might have forced his way free. But beyond 3, the combined force was enough to hold him completely. He could feel his arms and legs being devoured, bit by living bit. He had to find a way to break free, and fast, or death was certain. Break through from above? His head would be an easy target. From the side, with his limbs held, he could barely generate force. Perhaps the only option was below, though it seemed like a long shot. Just as he struggled to think, a voice rang out unexpectedly. It was full of righteous fervor, crying out against the vampires. Gunther was baffled, unable to make sense of what he was hearing. Then more voices chimed in, echoing the same cry. They shouted the rallying cry that justice would ultimately triumph over evil. An ugly hand reached up to touch one of the shouting faces. A dark creature appeared and introduced himself as Bonsar. With obvious pride, he explained that these were his collection of heroes, warriors who had once sacrificed themselves for humanity, now possessing beautiful faces. Their spirits would be frozen in place forever, until the last human perished. He asked Gunther dreamily whether this hell was not beautiful. Gunther replied calmly that he didn't belong here. Bonsar praised his formidable spirit and earnestly invited him to join. Gunther declined again, bluntly stating that he was not good-looking. That reason gave Bonsar pause. He finally asked with genuine curiosity whether it was truly that bad. Gunther grinned and removed his helmet without a moment's hesitation. The sight of his face prompted Bonsar to blurt out that he looked like a monster. Gunther found it absurd to be called a monster by a monster. He seized the moment, suggesting that since Bonsar didn't want him, he should let him go. Bonsar flew into a rage, declaring there was absolutely no chance of escape. Gunther said it was Bonsar himself who had shown him the way out. Under Bonsar's puzzled gaze, he let out a quiet, sly chuckle. He announced that he had good teeth too. The words had barely left his mouth before he wrenched his head around and bit down on one of the nearby faces. The insane act left Bonsar momentarily stunned. Then he broke into a roaring laugh. He mocked Gunther for thinking he could bite his way to freedom. What a fantasy. No one would ever escape from here. But Gunther clamped down and held on, refusing to let go. He roared that he wasn't just anyone. He was Gunther. He tore savagely and against all odds ripped the face clean off. He bellowed that he would survive, no matter what it took. The shocking sight brought even Bonsar to a standstill. Outside, Arian and Reiner watched the terrifying mass in despair. Reiner believed Gunther had been consumed and fell into a deep, bitter regret. He thought he never should have staked humanity's future on him. Humanity was about to perish because of that mistake. Then, in that moment of despair, Arian suddenly pointed. Several heads tumbled free from the mass. Then a gap tore open in the mass, and Gunther burst out from within like a cannonball. Reiner's expression flipped instantly, and he cried out that he had believed in him all along. Gunther had barely hit the ground before Bonsar's savage strikes came in pursuit. He narrowly dodged, but Reiner noticed that his legs were gone. Gunther looked up and immediately declared they had to change tactics. Close combat was a lost cause. They had to find another way out. He hoisted Arian onto his back and laid out the new plan: run with everything they had before the sun came up. The sudden shift to a full retreat left Reiner completely baffled. An overwhelming sea of faces surged toward them. Gunther reacted in a flash, pulling Arian out of the attack's path just in time. With nothing but his arms, he dragged her along at speed. Arian quickly reminded him that spare mechanical limbs were hidden nearby. Gunther flatly refused. There was no time to fit them now. He told her to hold on tight. Their one and only goal right now was to run. The faces crawled across the ceiling, relentlessly tracking their every move. Arian looked back and found herself eye to eye with a leering face. It told her plainly how much it liked her pretty face. All the other faces joined in, clamoring to claim her for themselves. Gunther shielded her and slipped into the shadows, noting how obsessively fixated Bonsar was on her. He lowered his voice and asked how much time was left until sunrise. Arian calculated from the previous day's timing and answered, about 5 minutes. Gunther decided to stay hidden right there and wait for the dawn to bring salvation. But then screams of terror suddenly erupted behind them, shattering the plan. Reiner and the others sheltering under the iron cage had been surrounded. Their desperate cries reached him, begging Gunther to save them. Gunther's expression darkened, and he spoke the brutal decision: sacrifice them. Only then would the rest of them have a chance to reach the exit. It was the only choice to be made for the future of humanity. He looked to Arian, hoping she would understand. Arian only watched him in silence, saying nothing. Gunther's heart clenched, and in the very next second his instinct proved right. Arian stepped out abruptly and shouted out toward Bonsar. She drew every bit of Bonsar's attention onto herself. Gunther cursed at her furiously but had no choice but to follow. Bonsar turned exactly as expected and lunged toward her. Gunther scooped her up and turned to run. He demanded to know why she hadn't listened to him and insisted on doing things her way. Arian shot back that as long as there was any hope, you didn't abandon your comrades. Gunther had no answer for that. There was nothing left to do but fight with their lives. He carried her on his back and made a straight run for the only exit. Bonsar stayed on them like a shadow, declaring he would drag them both into his hell. Gunther paid him no mind and plunged through the exit, clawing his way up the narrow stairwell. Bonsar's massive form forced itself into the passageway in pursuit. Arian suddenly cried out and pointed ahead. Morning light was already streaming down. Hope was within reach. They were almost there. The words had barely left her lips before a violent tremor hit. Bonsar had caught up and sank his teeth into Gunther's arm. Searing pain shot through him, and Gunther roared at him to let go. Without a moment's hesitation, he abandoned that arm entirely. With only one arm, he kept leaping and climbing upward. Bonsar was closing in, nearly reaching him again. In the very last instant, they burst into the morning light. Warm sunlight washed over them, scattering the darkness. Gunther had barely exhaled with relief before his heart seized. From behind him came Arian's terrified cry for help. He spun around and saw her being dragged by Bonsar. At the very last moment, she had been caught. Bonsar showed a triumphant snarl and began to retreat slowly back into the shadows. He had finally gotten the beautiful face he wanted most. Arian struggled in vain as the light grew further and further away. In that moment, Gunther's world came completely undone. He watched helplessly as that figure disappeared into the depths of the darkness. One of Bonsar's faces had been left behind. It was immediately incinerated by the sunlight. Bonsar's true form retreated into the shadows of his lair. The lesser vampires swarmed around him in a panic, anxiously asking if he was all right. Several of Bonsar's faces opened their mouths at once. He spoke with grief and fury, lamenting that he had failed to avenge his fallen family. His followers erupted in outrage, immediately clamoring to go and seek revenge. But Bonsar stopped them with a sharp command, knowing full well they were no match for that man. He could not bear to lose a single one of his family again. The revenge had to be carried out by his own hand, and for that he needed more power. He rasped out the order: he needed more fresh human faces. The lesser vampires understood immediately, excitedly displaying their latest harvest. They paraded 34 trembling humans forward like an offering. Bonsar's gaze swept over them. He admired their faces with satisfied praise, but his eyes ultimately came to rest, fixed unwaveringly on Arian. He chuckled softly, telling her that this face was still his favorite of all. She had nothing to fear. She would remain within him until the very end of humanity. On the other side, Gunther was venting his frustration at Reiner with impatience roars. He was urging him to hurry up and finish fitting the new limbs. The red line of life in his hand had already faded more than halfway. With less than an hour of free movement left, his anxiety burned. Grasping at any hope, he asked whether there was any alternative. As long as there was a new power host, he could be revived again. But Reiner coldly turned the question back on him, asking whether that meant he wasn't planning to rescue Arian. He then crushed that hope entirely, making clear it was absolutely impossible. The device in his brain was not truly a resurrection instrument. It could only sustain the movement of a body that had just recently died. The window for reanimating a corpse was a mere 3 days. It was only because they had received news of his death too late that they had risked everything to save him here. Developing a new power host was a distant prospect, perhaps never possible at all. Without Arian, he was destined for permanent, final death. After a long silence, Gunther pressed Reiner for the truth about the device in his brain, but Reiner refused to say, citing insufficient trust. Before long, the new limbs were fitted, though the right arm remained empty. Reiner explained that a special weapon had been prepared for that slot. Since close combat offered no chance of victory, they would try ranged attacks instead. He held up a modified human body weapon. Gunther stared at it for a long moment, then let out a short, cold laugh of understanding. Meanwhile, in the vampire's prison, fear spread like a plague. One captive broke down in tears, only to be harshly silenced by a vampire. Bonsar's true form reached out a greedy hand and stroked that person's face. He made a gentle promise that the process would be painless. Bonsar's blood crawled across the captive's face like a living thing, until even the terrified eyes eyes were completely swallowed and engulfed. The body crumpled to the ground. The head had already fallen into Bonsar's hands. The other humans who witnessed this hellish scene nearly lost their minds entirely. Only Arian watched in silence, her face utterly expressionless. Bonsar's gaze turned to her, announcing that she was next. The face that had already been connected to Bonsar's will broke into a smile. Arian's eyes remained perfectly still, undisturbed. That righteous gaze only excited Bonsar all the more. He longed to see those eyes consumed by regret and terror. But Arian said quietly that the most frightening thing was this, that across all those long years, not a single person had ever tried to save Bonsar's fallen soul. The words made Bonsar freeze for a moment, then fill with exhilaration. He declared eagerly that he would preserve those words alongside her face as part of his collection. Just as he moved to act, a human man came charging in with a furious roar. He screamed a battle cry about ridding the world of this evil for humanity's sake, and drove his blade toward the monster. But the gap in strength was vast. In an instant, he was pinned down under a writhing mass of faces. The man refused to yield, clinging to the belief that the human spirit could never be extinguished. He was certain that a hero would come and cut out Bonsar's heart. This declaration filled Bonsar with tremendous delight. He mocked humans for their hollow, self-righteous pretense at nobility. The man snarled back that a butcher like him had no idea what conviction even meant. Bonsar laughed and told him to look at these ugly hands of his. He began to recall a fire, the desperate, selfless rush into the flames. Through the searing agony of melting skin, he had run and run to save as many as he could. But the praise and respect he received as a hero were as fleeting as a flower that blooms for a single day. What followed was endless contempt and rejection from the world. The man refused to believe it, demanding to know why people would treat him that way if it were true. Bonsar slowly peeled away the last of his disguise. The answer was simple. It was because of this face, destroyed by fire. The man was struck speechless by the horrifying sight. Bonsar trembled as he said that this was exactly the look that saw a monster. The people who had once called him a hero all turned away the moment they saw his face. Had he done something wrong? No. He had thrown himself into danger for the sake of humanity. Yet purely because of a face that looked like a monster's, he was cast out by all of humankind. Bonsar broke down, covering his face with his hands. In that moment, he looked fragile and utterly helpless. He rasped out his conclusion, that sacrifice for humanity meant nothing, because the one thing humans were most skilled at was hurting each other. Those words enraged the pinned man. He argued that a painful past was no justification for slaughtering humans. A darkness came over Bonsar's eyes. He said humans would eventually understand their true intentions. He revealed the mass of blood and flesh in his palm like a cluster of eggs and reached toward the man. The man shut his eyes in despair. At the last possible moment, Gunther's impatient voice rang out. In the next instant, a flash of cold light cut through, and Bonsar's arm was severed. Gunther flexed the newly fitted mechanical arm, muttering that the accuracy was too low, and Arian's calm face finally broke into a look of relief and joy. Gunther let out a breath too, relieved that she was still alive. The pain of losing his arm threw Bonsar into a fury. Gunther showed no fear whatsoever. In fact, the provocation only fired him up. The tension in the room snapped taut in an instant, and the final confrontation was upon them. The weapon Gunther gripped was known as the bone launcher. It was no ordinary weapon. It was the brutal product of human body modification. Hard bone spines, carved from bison shin bone, were wrapped in strong muscle fibers. Through the tensing of specialized muscles, the spines could be launched with terrifying force. Its power far surpassed a human stone crossbow, and its speed was breathtaking. But the cost was equally steep. Each full draw required a lengthy preparation time, and it could only load and fire 6 bone spines in total. Still, Gunther was more than satisfied with that. Before entering the lair, Reiner warned him one more time. Time was critical. He had to prioritize killing the higher vampire. Only when Bonsar fell would the lesser followers perish with him. If he got bogged down by lesser vampires unafraid of sunlight, death was certain. Gunther listened, then charged without hesitation into the dark ruins of the lair. Once inside, he glanced at his wrist. Only 15 minutes of time remaining. Muscles stretched to their limit. The first bone spine was launched. It went wide, and Bonsar mocked the weapon as disgusting and laughable. He was confident that no weapon could penetrate his wall of flesh. But before the words had finished, the second strike arrived. The bone spine grazed across his skull and punched straight through his massive body, narrowly missing the heart, unfortunately. But Gunther had gotten the feel for it. The next shot would go straight for the kill. Bonsar felt the very real threat now. He commanded his followers to take cover immediately, but the lesser vampires stepped forward on their own, offering to buy him time. They came surging from every direction. Gunther was forced to fight them barehanded. The dull crack of fist-shattering bone echoed continuously through the cavern. One vampire seized the moment and slipped behind him. He declared their will was steel and they would never submit. Gunther reached back and grabbed him by the skull, and crushed it with a sudden explosive squeeze as the vampire's broken curses faded. Bonsar was completely pushed over the edge, letting out a deafening roar. More vampires surged forward, surrounding Gunther on all sides. They threw themselves at him without end, with no fear of death in their eyes. Gunther snapped another enemy's neck. He found himself puzzled. Why weren't they afraid to die? A vampire sprawled on the ground grabbed hold of his ankle. He said that from the moment they were rejected and despised by everyone, they had stopped fearing death. With that, he opened his mouth, but the pain came from above instead. Bonsar had clamped his jaws down hard on Gunther's head. He intended to make good on his promise, starting by tearing into that hated face. A sharp crack rang out. Gunther used used a bone spine to sever the part biting him. He kicked the vampire off his feet with force, and barely dodged yet another lunge from Bonsar, but his heart sank. Only 3 bone spines left, and the swarm of grotesque faces before him was overwhelming. He had no way of telling where the true core was hidden. Just then, a familiar voice cut through the chaos of the battlefield. Arian was standing at a height above, calling Bonsar's name at the top of her lungs, with no regard for herself. Gunther couldn't understand why she was doing this. The lesser vampires shoved her roughly, ordering her to shut her mouth immediately, but she seemed not to hear them, and kept calling out that name with relentless persistence. Just as Gunther's attention was split, a flash of red light sliced past his body. Another vampire came screaming in at him. He fought off the attack with one hand, while Arian's voice continued without pause. Gunther thought she had lost her mind. A lesser vampire yanked her by the hair, trying to silence her. Arian gathered every ounce of strength and hurled insults at Bonsar, calling him a revolting monster. Bonsar was provoked into anger. He snarled at her that stalling for time was pointless, but Arian told Gunther to look closely at the faces. Some would react first. The faces most directly connected to his true core always moved a fraction faster. The vampire covering her mouth flew into a rage, threatening to rip out her tongue. At that exact instant, Gunther fired a bone spine without hesitation. He understood now when she shouted. Certain faces did ripple first. The bone spine hit with precision, and Bonsar's hiding spot was instantly exposed. He let out a scornful laugh, confident he could simply retreat back into the massive faces. But in the next second, his laugh cut off abruptly. He discovered in horror that the neural connections at his back had been severed. He had to reconnect them immediately. It would be dangerous otherwise. Gunther gave him no such chance, declaring his end with cold finality. The remaining 2 bone spines, both of them were going to him right now. Another spine tore through the air, aimed straight at Bonsar's core. Bonsar frantically worked to repair the severed neural connections. Gunther gathered the last of his strength and lined up the final shot. The lesser vampires surged in like a flood, trying to swallow him completely. They piled on top of each other, pinning him and his weapon down with their sheer weight, but that final bone spine still broke through every obstacle and drove straight toward a terrified Bonsar. The spine struck, and the wound began to burn and melt as if seared by raging fire. Arian looked on with tense eyes, but her heart sank once more. Bonsar's hand was still moving. The shot had missed his heart, and now Gunther had run out of both time and bone spines. But Gunther tore the vampires off himself and firmly rejected defeat. He said it wasn't over yet because there was one last shot. Arian had no idea what he meant. The time was already up. The blinking red dot on his wrist was the signal that he was at his absolute limit. Gunther poured the last flicker of his remaining strength into a single concentrated point. He launched himself upward, his figure like a final arrow loosed from the bow. He declared that he himself was the last bone spine. His body became the weapon, hurtling straight toward what remained of Bonsar's heart. Victory was within reach, close enough to touch, and yet in that decisive moment Bonsar began to regenerate. One of his eyes had already opened. Bonsar was dragged back into his painful past. As a young man, he had stepped forward with conviction to join the city guard, burning with a desire to become a heroic warrior, just like his father. Back then, his eyes were bright and clear, full of hope. Then a fire took everything, leaving nothing but a ruined face and one remaining eye. Walking down the street, children threw rocks at him and called him a monster. He could only lower his head and carve that word into his heart. Tears of blood and sorrow slid down his face as he was filled with desperate questions. He didn't understand whether his father's sacrifice for humanity had truly been worth it. He didn't know whether he himself should sacrifice for the people who saw him as a monster. He crouched on the ground and curled himself into the smallest shape he could. Then, a hand came to rest gently on the top of his head. A vampire appeared before him. He said he had been watching for a long time. He laid out a sweeping vision of a new world to be built, and admitted honestly that the path would be hard. He needed someone like him. Bonsar asked what kind of world it would be. As he listened to the description, his eyes slowly widened. When that hand reached out toward him, his heart was torn with conflict. In the end, he lifted his head and took the hand, choosing to join. But the memory was shattered by a thunderous crash. Gunther's fist had driven straight through his heart. Bonsar went still. Then, of all things, a look of relief spread across his face. Before fading, he asked one final question. Among the heroes humanity yearned for, was there room for a monster like him? Before the words had even finished, his form dissolved into ash and was gone. Every lesser vampire vanished along with him without a trace. Gunther smiled with the satisfaction of victory, but his strength was completely spent. He closed his eyes and fell backward heavily. He didn't know how much time passed before he awoke to the jolting of a moving cart. Around him were the excited voices of his companions. Energy was being transferred into him. He was told not to move around. Reiner praised him enthusiastically for having taken down the higher vampire. The lesser vampires had vanished along with him. When the source that supplied the blood died, all the vampires it had spawned were destroyed alongside it. Gunther immediately thought, in that case, just eliminating the pure blood leader would do. But Arian told him that the last pure blood had long since gone into hiding. Since the day he killed the Emperor, he had not been seen again. Gunther was puzzled. Why would a powerful pure blood not join the fight? Arian admitted honestly that they didn't know the reason either. The more Gunther thought about it, the more contradictions he found. Why would vampires who fed on human blood want to exterminate humanity? Reiner acknowledged that it was strange. They invited Gunther to come to headquarters where it could be explained in more detail. They also told him that headquarters was humanity's last stronghold, a sanctuary for survivors that had never been breached in hundreds of years. It was also where research on him would be conducted and his supplies replenished. Reiner pointed eagerly out the window, saying they were almost there. That was where humanity's hope for a counterattack would begin. But when Gunther looked up, what he saw was not a stronghold. It was a roaring inferno shooting into the sky, thick with smoke. The so-called sanctuary was being devoured by a sea of fire. Gunther let out a cold laugh, mocking that humanity's hope was burning. A higher vampire was startled awake from his slumber. He had heard news of Bonsar's death. The shock nearly made him lose his wits. Convinced that the enemy had finally come to finish him off, another vampire stepped in to stop his panicked flight. Signaling that there had been no enemy intrusion, they expressed their sorrow over Bonsar's death, then asked Julius whether it was the work of humans. Julius was silent, then gave his order. The one responsible for killing Bonsar had to be found and investigated thoroughly. His narrowing eyes and displeased expression made clear just how serious things had become. Meanwhile, the place known as the Sanctuary, Bahar, had become a sea of flames. The island was strategically situated, surrounded on all sides by sheer cliffs, with only one bridge connecting it to the outside world. It seemed like an impregnable fortress bestowed by divine providence. When Reiner's group arrived, they were left speechless by the devastation before them. They soon encountered the garrison commander, Leonard. Leonard exhaled with relief at seeing them return safely. He was especially concerned about Arian's well-being, but when his gaze landed on Gunther, his expression froze. He noticed the tube sustaining Gunther's life. He clicked his tongue quietly, making no effort to hide it. Gunther felt that unmasked scrutiny and hostility. Leonard gestured for them to come inside and rest. Gunther walked across the creaking floorboards and made a sarcastic comment about how decrepit the sanctuary looked. Leonard explained that with the fighting so intense, they had lost the ability to maintain the outer areas. Then he received word that Bonsar had been dealt with. Gunther curled the corner of his mouth and admitted to it casually. Leonard studied him for a long moment, then let out another quiet, pointed click of his tongue. He recounted what the sanctuary had endured in the attack. The vampires had been strange. They had turned the slaughter into a frenzied performance with grotesque theatrics. Gunther gave a dismissive snort, comparing it to a ridiculous circus. Leonard shot back in anger that anyone who had lived through it would find nothing funny. His forces had suffered devastating losses and could barely hold against another assault, so he made his request. He wanted Gunther to be stationed at the outer perimeter to protect the bridge. Gunther refused without a second thought. He said that with Leonard's troops acting as the shield, his own odds of survival were much higher. That remark finally lit the fuse on Leonard's long-suppressed rage. He demanded to know whether Gunther understood why he was standing here at all. 136 people had willingly sacrificed themselves to give him life. A research team had worked day and night to build his mechanical limbs. Frontline soldiers had staked their lives to hold this broken sanctuary. And Gunther, without a shred of gratitude, was willing to hurt others purely for his own sake. He beat his chest and roared that someone like this had no right to call himself a knight. The will of the zombie knight should be passed down by him instead. Gunther just watched his furious outburst with cold, detached eyes. Then, without warning, he solemnly complimented Leonard on being upright and handsome. Leonard was thrown off for a moment by that sudden shift. Then Gunther leaned close to his ear and breathed a crude, cutting insult. The humiliation of being toyed with snapped Leonard's composure in an instant. He drew his sword in a blind rage, roaring and hacking straight at Gunther. But Leonard was sent flying by a tremendous force. He crashed hard onto the ground outside. Arian rushed up to Gunther, scolding him for using large movements while recharging. Gunther maintained that he was merely acting in self-defense. Arian looked at him, not knowing what to say. As night fell, Leonard's neck was already wrapped in bandages. Gunther remarked with disappointment that he hadn't managed to send him to the afterlife. Arian cut him off immediately, speaking to Gunther with firm seriousness. Humanity's victory couldn't rely on him fighting blindly on his own. Building his body had consumed an enormous amount of manpower and precious resources. Gunther's body needed a constant supply of materials and human support, so he had to save as many people as possible and protect this sanctuary. Gunther swallowed his irritation and grasped what she was saying. He told them to hurry up and bring him his weapons. Reiner started searching and came up with only 2. Gunther could barely believe his eyes. Only 2? Leonard apologized, explaining that all manpower had been directed toward defense and firefighting. Gunther held up one of the strange weapons. It looked like a crocodile's jaws, with a flat expression. Leonard explained that it was a weapon capable of a tremendous biting force. Gunther answered with an unimpressed click of his tongue. He fitted the other weapon instead, which looked something like an umbrella. When opened, it became a solid shield. Arian explained it was called a hide shield, stronger than steel and fireproof. Gunther asked when the bone launcher from before could be produced again. Arian said it would take at least half a year. Every weapon required a vast amount of materials and was essentially single use. Gunther felt that nothing was going right and his mood soured. Just then, Leonard and Reiner were called away by other matters, leaving only Gunther and Arian in the quiet. As the energy transfer continued, the night deepened. Gunther practiced swinging a sword with his left hand. He was ready for whatever battle was coming. Then Arian brought up what Commander Leonard had said earlier. He had been chosen through a process agreed upon by over 100 people, selected as the most suitable zombie knight by both the royal family and the nobility. ability, so she hoped he wouldn't doubt that his existence was necessary. She also believed he could save this world. Gunther said he wasn't bothered, but then he suddenly asked, had 136 people truly died for this? Arian gave him a quiet answer of yes. Gunther couldn't understand it. How could someone go through with something knowing they would die for it? Arian's answer was simple, because someone had to. Gunther turned his head and finally murmured that he just couldn't understand it. At that moment, Leonard suddenly burst in, shouting that they had arrived. Everyone rushed to the bridge. Gunther decisively pulled out the energy connection tube. Leonard pulled Arian away, but she turned to give Gunther one last word. She pleaded with him to survive, no matter what. Gunther answered her with quiet confidence. He put on his helmet, drew his sword, and opened the shield. He faced the darkness and swore to crush whatever came at him. A figure emerged from the shadows. She murmured with apparent curiosity that it seemed there was only one audience member tonight. Her movements were strangely unnatural, her body seemingly twisted by some unseen force. He calculated quickly, deciding he would try to end this with a single blow. He steadied himself and waited for her to close the distance. But the vampire in the distance suddenly spoke, her voice halting and eerie. She announced that her name was Ebellin, and that she had prepared a performance for the audience. Before she'd even finished, she leaped to Gunther's side in an instant, impossibly fast. Gunther thrust his sword without hesitation, but the blade found nothing. That twisted body had slipped away with ease. Gunther felt a jolt of unease. How had she done that? Ebellin writhed and crawled across the ground, chiding the audience for not following the order of the show. She announced that the first act was now officially beginning. The performance was titled The Pig King and the Dwarf Chorus. She sliced her palm with a sharp fingernail, and the blood and flesh began to grow wildly like vines. Sinew and muscle shot upward, weaving together into an enormous grotesque tent. Just as Leonard had described, a small opening appeared at the base of the tent. Something came bursting out of it. Gunther raised his shield, and found himself looking at a vampire wearing a pig snout mask. It let out a strange howl and leaped aside. Then more of its kind came flooding in. This mob of frenzied small creatures swarmed Gunther instantly, surrounding him on all sides. Gunther's sword cut through the air like a cold crescent moon. Any vampire that came close was sliced clean through, blood spraying in all directions. He kept swinging, each strike precisely cutting down the monsters that lunged at him. One vampire's blade locked with his, trembling with fear. Gunther drove down with sudden force, and the sword sank into the creature's body. But the monsters seemed endless. Another always stepped up for everyone that fell. Gunther made a swift decision, broke out of the encirclement, and charged straight for the entrance to the tent. Better to go straight for the head than to keep wrestling with these foot soldiers. In the darkness of the entrance, a pair of enormous tusks appeared, followed by a gush of scorching flames. Gunther blocked with the hide shield and came out completely unscathed. A fat white pig wearing a crown crawled slowly out. Gunther smirked, so that was where the title Pig King came from. On the Pig King's neck, a vampire brandished a torch and bellowed commands. He ordered the king to breathe fire and destroy this hateful enemy before them. The vampire laughed with arrogant delight, certain no one could survive those flames. The fire kept burning, but Gunther's feet remained planted like stone. From behind the shield, he waited and looked for his opening to strike back. The vampire was astounded and urged the Pig King to unleash even more power. The flames surged again, almost consuming everything. And at that moment, Gunther moved. All the force he had been building exploded outward. He swung his sword and drove it straight into the Pig King. With one clean stroke, the enormous Pig King was split in two. The vampire perched on its neck was scared out of his wits. He had no time to react before Gunther's fist was already upon him. Gunther punched straight through the vampire's disintegrating body. He landed steadily, ash and the scent of death drifting all around him. The Pig King crumbled to ash, and the rest of the vampires dissolved along with it. Gunther turned his gaze toward the deep darkness of the entrance. He was going to see this performance's second act for himself. Gunther walked into the tent with his sword drawn. His eyes swept across the many carefully arranged props. The theater looked comfortable and beautiful, almost nothing like a battlefield. Ebellin called him the first audience member to arrive. She was about to announce the title of the second act when his blade was already swinging, but once again, she slipped away from the strike in an impossible manner. Gunther had been sure he had found the perfect opening. How could she dodge so effortlessly? What exactly was wrong with that body of hers? Ebellin seemed completely unbothered and went right back to the announcement he had interrupted. She sliced her palm open again, letting blood and flesh pour out in a wild surge. The writhing mass rapidly enveloped her entire body, forming a horrifying shell. She hung upside down and declared this performance was the voice of Ebellin's heart. Then her face was covered too, her body twisting into a grotesque posture. All that could be seen was an enormous mouth announcing that the performance had officially begun. Gunther swung his sword without hesitation, and the prop split apart on impact. He spun around immediately to press the attack, only to have her slip away from him once again. He cursed inwardly. If she was that good at dodging, then let her her try this. He kicked up several fragments of debris and sent them flying like a volley of shots, but Ebellin calmly evaded every last one. Gunther fell into a brief silence, turning over strategies in his mind. Just then, Ebellin slowly drew a weapon from that enormous mouth. One blade, then another. Twin swords flashed with cold light as they came thrusting toward him. Gunther raised his shield and met the fierce assault with his own sword. The two of them clashed inside the tent in a deadlock evenly matched. No matter how Gunther attacked, Ebellin seemed to read it in advance and was already out of the way. Frustration built in him. Every strike was missing, so how was he supposed to hit her? Ebellin's blade suddenly drove straight at his face, forcing him to fall back. To dodge, he had no choice but to leap outside the tent. Ebellin followed right after, appearing before him like his own shadow. Farther back, his companions were watching the battle tensely through a telescope. Reiner asked urgently whether Gunther was dominating the fight. Leonard's response made everyone's heart drop. Gunther appeared to be losing ground, pressed back onto the bridge. Arian watched in silence, her eyes fixed on the scene. On the bridge, Gunther was throwing everything he had into stopping Ebellin's advance. Seeing that Gunther was relying on his shield for defense, Ebellin shifted her attack to his lower body. Gunther leaped to counter but missed again, clicking his tongue in frustration. Ebellin was slippery as an eel, her assault relentless and unbroken. Arian, watching through the telescope, had spotted the key. She seemed able to avoid any attack she was consciously aware of. Reiner asked anxiously whether there was anything they could do to help. Leonard said helplessly that all they had available were bows and arrows. Arian pointed out that what made things worse was the choice of the bridge as a battlefield. Reiner didn't follow, so Arian laid it out calmly. Gunther's muscle density was extremely high, heavy, with almost no fat. If he fell in, he would sink. As if to confirm her assessment, the bridge railing was shattered in the next moment. Ebellin's relentless assault had driven Gunther to the very edge. Beneath him, the sea stretched down into bottomless darkness. Gunther himself understood instantly just how lethal this situation was. There would be nothing to push off from underwater. For him, it would be an abyss. A splash rang out, but it was not Gunther who had plunged into the deep. He had jammed his long sword against a bridge pillar, his body hanging in midair. The ice-cold sea roared below his feet, swallowing everything. He urgently checked the time he had left. Ebellin's figure was about to leap down from the bridge. Without a moment's hesitation, he drove himself upward, flipping back onto the bridge to keep fighting. Their blades crossed once more, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Gunther had to admit that his opponent was formidably strong, beyond the ordinary. But he still held onto one thread of hope, trusting in the people behind those walls. Arian and Reiner, surely they had worked out the perfect plan by now. Then in the very next second, the call to retreat came from the walls. Gunther felt a sudden wave of speechlessness and awkwardness, but with no time to spare, he broke away from the fight as quickly as he could. The city gates slammed shut behind him, cutting off the danger outside. He demanded urgently to know what the battle plan actually was. Arian quietly held out the tube connecting to his power source. The plan was simple: hold out until sunrise. 5 hours remained until dawn, and after each recharge, he could only move for 2 hours at most. That meant he would have to keep coming back to replenish his energy between fights. Arian gripped his wrist and pointed out the most critical weakness. Each recharge took a full 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, he would be completely vulnerable and unable to move. Some other method was needed to protect both him and Arian during that time. Gunther asked what that method was, but Reiner hedged and stumbled over his words. A faint creak reached them. The wooden door had been pushed open a crack. Leonard had been outside listening to everything, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. The soldier outside sounded the alarm. The higher vampire was closing in. Leonard snapped the door shut and turned to face his soldiers. His order was absolute: hold for 20 minutes, no matter the cost. Gunther knew all too well the difference between ordinary people and monsters. Those 20 minutes, everyone outside would likely be dead by the end of it, Reiner said quietly. That they all knew. Everyone out there was walking knowingly to their death. A complicated feeling welled up inside Gunther. Outside, Leonard and his soldiers had already formed their line. The silent wait was more agonizing than the fighting itself. Then at last, a violent crash announced that death had broken through the door. Inside, the sound made Arian and the others flinch from head to toe. Then crimson liquid began to seep in under the gap at the bottom of the door. Gunther's face remained cold as ever, but the unbroken screams outside drew his brows into a tight knot. Outside, someone had managed to land a hit on Ebellin, but it did nothing. Leonard was sent flying by a tremendous impact. Ebellin came down directly on top of his shield. The face beneath the shield twisted and distorted under the crushing weight, fighting for breath. Her other sword was already raised high, aimed straight at his heart. At the last possible instant, a massive jaw burst through the door. Gunther was controlling his other weapon, driving it hard into Ebellin. Leonard was stunned. There was still time left on the clock. Reiner was worried. Without hitting the heart, there was no way to win. Arian was also concerned about the power running low. At that moment, Gunther made a wild decision. He roared about changing the battlefield and hauled Ebellin away from the castle by force. Gunther dragged the shrieking vampire and hurled them both off the cliff. He called out loudly that the stage for the third act was the sea, where neither of them could escape. Gunther and Ebellin grappled fiercely in the deep water. He seized his chance. The fist he had been charging for so long finally crashed into her body with full force. The moment the hit landed, a surge of fierce exhilaration swept through him. He reached again, going for the fatal heart. But Ebellin suddenly spun her head around and opened a gaping savage maw. Her body coiled like a snake, wrapping itself around Gunther entirely. An ice-cold blade found the gap in his armor and drove in, bringing a searing pain. She even laughed as she twisted the blade, deepening the agony. Gunther clenched his jaw and bore the pain, falling together with her into the darker abyss below. One of his arms had been severed, drifting behind them, but he tore savagely at Ebellin's body in return, refusing to give an inch. Ebellin drove her sword in again, burying it deep in his chest. Both of them screamed soundlessly in the pain. Blood spread through the water like a mist. The sea around them churned into murky chaos, and nothing of the battle could be seen. Ebellin broke through the blood-red haze first and began to rise. Gunther was right behind her, lunging at the enemy again with stunning willpower. He sank his teeth into her body and held on with everything he had, refusing to be broken. Was that really supposed to be enough to kill him? He tore with all his strength and ripped her chest cavity open. The beating heart was finally exposed to the cold seawater. Ebellin raised her sword to strike, and Gunther opened his mouth and bit toward that heart. In the split second between life and death, his memory was suddenly pulled far into the past. There was an old woman who had taken him in, his one and only family. She had once been amazed that Gunther had memories from his infancy. She spoke of that filthy dump where not even insects would linger. From there had come the faint but fierce cry of a newborn. The old woman said that cry was the last desperate call of a life clinging on. She had been deeply curious at the time. Why would a life that no one wanted, a baby slowly dying beside a pile of garbage, cry out so desperately hard? What was worth fighting so hard to hold on to in a life like that? Young Gunther stood before her, his fists dripping blood, gasping as he asked, "What was that meaning?" The old woman grabbed his face hard and shouted at the top of her lungs. She told him that meaning was revenge. No one had wanted him born and no one had wanted him to live, but he would fight to the very last moment, clinging to life with everything he had. To have that strength and that right, that was the best revenge against the parents who abandoned him, against the entire cold and indifferent world that had turned its back on him. Young Gunther in the memory heard her out and let a smile curl his lips. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, his gaze had gone impossibly soft. The old woman smiled too, warm with relief. She encouraged him to prepare for the next battle. It was time to prove his will to the world. Deep in the sea, that memory rekindled the fire in Gunther's eyes. Against all the odds, he laughed. Then Leonard's voice and silhouette seemed to reach him through the water. They had found his severed head floating on the surface. It was only because his head was lighter that it had been cut free and drifted up here. His head was carefully lifted. Arian held it tightly in her arms, her face full of grief and determination. Leonard urged everyone to move quickly. The war wasn't over. Gunther's head kept twisting and turning on the table. Reiner stared, slightly dazed. Gunther struggled uselessly. Without a body, he couldn't speak. Arian reassured him that he only had to wait a little while. His body would be reattached soon. Once fully reassembled, Gunther let out a long breath and said he was glad to have that nuisance dealt with. But Leonard cut in with a grave expression. He thought the vampire might still be alive. Gunther immediately pushed back, saying he remembered biting through her heart. Leonard explained that they had found unusual tracks on the beach. Following them, they had come across a highly suspicious carriage. He speculated it might be a hiding place the vampire was using. Gunther found the reasoning absurd and trusted his own memory completely. But to be safe, they decided to go check immediately. Gunther clicked his tongue with displeasure, visibly irritated at being doubted. They crept along behind the bushes. The carriage had a distinctly unsettling air about it. Gunther still maintained his position out loud, but inwardly he was beginning to waver. He went forward with his sword and found fresh tracks on the ground. The sealed windows only added to the strangeness of the place, though it was daytime now. Even if there was an enemy inside, the odds were heavily in their favor. He pushed the door open gently. Inside was a thick, impenetrable darkness. He had barely leaned in to look when the door behind him silently swung shut on its own. In the darkness, a pair of crimson eyes suddenly lit up. A killing intent washed over him. Gunther immediately raised his sword to block. Metal collided and threw off a scatter of sparks. He could only rely on instinct, defending himself with great difficulty in the complete dark. Finally, he slammed one lesser vampire hard out of the carriage. Just as he moved to finish off the other one, a lesser vampire crawled out to intervene. It recognized Gunther as the one who had killed the Pig King. Gunther sneered at their weakness, mocking that it barely counted as a fight. The vampire trembled as it explained. Most of them were failures, products that hadn't made the cut, creatures whose bodies were so warped they couldn't fight or walk normally. Gunther believed their killing of humans was something that could never be forgiven, but the vampire claimed they had no choice. It was a promise they were bound to keep. Then it said it wanted to take Gunther to see the final performance. Gunther stayed on guard and followed the small flicker of light deeper into the carriage. The lesser vampires around him and let out an irritating low hum. The guide explained that their master had raised them to be obedient pigs. Only that way could they produce merchandise that met the required standard. The curtain was pulled aside. What was called the most beautiful piece of merchandise came into view. Ebellin sat in a twisted posture. Gunther took a startled step back. She had no will to fight. She simply raised her eyes and watched him quietly. Gunther couldn't understand it. He had bitten through her heart. Ebellin explained. A vampire's heart had to be completely destroyed or they would not die. But with an incomplete heart, they lost the power to control blood. She sliced her palm open again. This time the blood only trickled down uselessly. Gunther understood. In her current state, she was no longer a threat. He raised his sword again and declared that the one to survive this time would still be him. But Ebellin didn't flinch or dodge in the face of the blade. There was even a faint trace of a smile in her eyes. Outside the carriage, Leonard was anxiously counting the minutes. A soldier reported that roughly 50 minutes remained. Unease hung thick in the air. One soldier suddenly asked whether those vampires had once been human too. The question caught Leonard off guard. The soldier recounted a story that chilled the blood, an urban legend. He said that countless vagrants and orphans had vanished without a trace. The people who searched for them eventually found the truth in a sunless underground place. It was filled with instruments of torture and iron bars, and mountains of bones. Everyone wanted to know what kind of place it was. The one telling the story said in a low voice that it was a workshop for producing merchandise. The more twisted and small a piece of merchandise was, the higher the price it could fetch. The listeners couldn't believe it. Who in the world would buy something so horrifying? The soldier answered that the buyers were mostly wealthy merchants and nobles seeking novelty. Owning a deformed person had once been a fashionable way to flaunt wealth and power. A third soldier, who had been silent all along, suddenly spoke up. He had heard that some of the survivors were eventually sold off to circuses across the land. The one telling the story turned to Leonard with a question that cut to the bone. If these vampires were the victims from back then, were the humans and the sanctuary of Bahar they were dying to protect still worth it? Leonard stood frozen in place, unable to give a single word of affirmation. Meanwhile, inside the carriage, the final struggle was playing out. Gunther's blade cut sharp and swift through the dim space. Ebellin moved lightly to avoid it, all while speaking of a distant suffering. She described being bound, having her bones broken, an endless agony. Even when she had wanted to die, her tormentors never cared about her pleas. Then one day, without any reason, they suddenly set her free. She couldn't understand it and pressed them. How could they let go so easily after all that time tormenting her? The lavishly dressed noble only scratched his face with a troubled expression, then sighed and offered a reason so absurd it defied belief. He said that deformed people were no longer in fashion. What had once been the most extreme suffering was nothing but an outdated pastime in the eyes of the powerful. She was eerily calm right now. She posed one final question to Gunther. She wanted to know what was fashionable now. Gunther held his attack and gave it genuine thought for a moment. Then he said that what was fashionable now was one man's story. A story about a man who would survive to the very end, no matter what happened. Ebellin closed her eyes with a numbness and said that performance sounded just as lonely and exhausting. In the next second, a tremendous force tore the carriage apart completely. In the roaring fire, Ebellin and the lesser vampires dissolved together. Gunther walked slowly out from the dying embers, his expression unreadable. Bahar beneath the night sky fell into a temporary quiet. On a distant shore, two figures spoke in low voices. The blonde man mentioned that Bahar had already taken down two higher vampires. The green-haired man was stunned, unable to believe they had that kind of capability. The blonde mentioned that they seemed to have gotten their hands on some kind of special weapon. The green-haired man asked how many higher vampires were left and was told 6 remained. He speculated that the scattered vampires were likely converging on Bahar right now. The blonde proposed going to Bahar to deliver supplies, since they were running low. The green-haired man immediately pushed back hard, snapping that he had lost his mind. He complained bitterly that Bahar had always looked down on them. He also stressed that his own territory, surrounded by sea on 3 sides, was far more secure. But then a strange sound cut his words off abruptly. A dark shape burst out of the water, sending up a spray of cold droplets. Those reddened eyes announced it plainly. The vampires had arrived. The next day, Gunther was dressed up in formal attire. He found it ridiculous and could barely contain his irritation. Arian explained that a distinguished guest was coming to honor the battle achievements. Gunther couldn't understand. Who could possibly matter more than life and death on the front line? Reiner made a grand entrance and warned him that the visitor held an exceptionally high position. She was the true ruler of Bahar at this moment, so he needed to watch every word and action. Gunther had no choice but to swallow his impatience. A grand carriage drew to a stop. An attendant announced loudly that the queen had arrived. Queen Olivia descended slowly, carrying herself with arrogant, regal grace. Arian and Reiner immediately bowed in respectful greeting. Gunther stood where he was without moving. The queen looked him over, the corner of her mouth curling with a measuring air. Then she covered her nose and mouth, expressing her distaste for the dust and smell of the place. Gunther couldn't help muttering that this was what a battlefield smelled like. Reiner immediately told him to shut his mouth. The queen then called Gunther by the wrong name, and it took an attendant's correction before she moved on. She looked up more carefully at his face. She remarked that the modifications had made him rather ugly, but she also acknowledged his achievement in killing the higher vampires. An attendant beside her heaped on praise, extolling the queen's benevolence and greatness. The queen moved inside, and expressed her displeasure again at the cobwebs in the corner. She asked Gunther lazily what kind of reward he wished to receive. Arian stepped in first, clearly laying out their current predicament. She asked the queen to provide more manpower and material support, stressing that the zombie night plan was already the turning point of the war. The queen cut her off with displeasure, saying she was not asking her, and made clear that resources were limited and full support was impossible. She positioned herself as the last royal family of humanity and said her responsibilities were many. Gunther found her hollow words completely impossible to follow. Reiner whispered that the queen had never believed in their plan and had directed resources elsewhere because of it. She was now likely too proud to admit she had been wrong. Arian was still pushing, at least for public recognition of those who had sacrificed themselves, but an attendant rebuked her for the rudeness, and the queen waved her off. She maintained that using a corpse in combat was barbaric and damaged the royal family's reputation. She insisted everything had to be kept in the shadows, with no official record left. Then she turned on her own and granted Gunther the title of Count, along with Southern territory. The attendant cheered again, praising it as a great and righteous decision. The queen lazily extended her hand, expecting Gunther to kiss the back of it. Gunther looked at that pampered, well-kept hand and finally snapped entirely. He raged that when survival itself was at stake, reputation and pride meant absolutely nothing. He accused everyone of serving a madwoman like this, saying humanity was doomed because of it. Arian shouted for him to stop, and Reiner scrambled to apologize, but it was already too late. The queen's face darkened with sudden furious anger. Just as she was about to erupt, Leonard came bursting in. He was carrying a wounded soldier, crying out that something terrible was approaching. Night fell, and the air over Bahar was heavier than it had ever been. Reiner was beside himself, convinced Gunther's outburst had ruined everything. Gunther stubbornly maintained he had no reason to play along with a woman like that. Arian confirmed with the wounded soldier whether Toronto had truly fallen in half a day. The soldier said that the moment that monster made landfall, everything was instantly destroyed. Just a few swings of its fists, and an entire town was leveled to the ground. Gunther found that hard to believe. His words were cut off by Reiner's trembling voice. He had spotted a massive shape standing on the ridge in the distance. When it began to move, the trees beneath its feet were crushed like blades of grass. This was no ordinary vampire. It was a true colossus. Gunther watched from the city wall with a cold dread he had never felt before. He had never imagined a vampire could exist in a form this terrifying. Arian explained that for higher vampires, blood was will and strength made tangible. As long as they had a sufficiently powerful will, they could transform into any form they desired. The monster before them, known as Miranda, was the one responsible for bringing down the capital. Its iron-like skin could withstand any attack. Gunther realized that Arian knew a great deal about it. Arian admitted that the resistance had studied it extensively. Gunther asked for a weakness, but the answer was devastating. That monster had no known weaknesses. Bahar fell into chaos. They raced out in a carriage heading for the battlefield. Arian said Miranda's skin was impenetrable, making it nearly impossible to reach the heart. If they allowed it to break into Bahar, the sanctuary would be completely annihilated. Gunther couldn't help remarking bitterly that rushing out there now sounded like a group suicide. Reiner quickly pushed back, saying it wasn't entirely hopeless. Arian pointed out that sunlight was the one and only weakness of higher vampires, so Miranda would never appear in giant form during daylight hours. It would change its shape and hide somewhere dark. Striking the killing blow when it was at its most vulnerable was the only option they had. Gunther gave a grim smile. It was essentially a game of hide and seek with their lives on the line. Reiner studied the map, calculating Miranda's speed and travel time. Fortunately, it should not be able to reach Bahar today. They had one day left, and this would be their final chance. Based on their estimates, they arrived at the village most likely to be Miranda's hiding spot. Sure enough, enormous footprints were there in the village. Gunther scanned the surroundings, restless and impatient. Leonard quickly assigned roles and split their limited forces into two groups, but the reinforcements that were supposed to be there were nowhere near their full number. A soldier explained that most of the manpower had been redirected by the queen to build defensive weapons. Gunther heard that and couldn't hold back a smug smile. Leonard had no time to argue. He ordered the search to begin immediately. Soldiers fanned out with torches, checking every shadowed corner. Empty rooms, abandoned crates and cabinets, nothing. Arian kept her eyes fixed on the pocket watch, every tick of the hand striking like a blow to the chest. Gunther impatiently kicked open yet another door, empty again. He reasoned that a steel giant would probably prefer somewhere more spacious, so he went to a large wardrobe. He swung his sword and split the cabinet doors open with one strike, but behind them was only a wall. Outside, the evening sky had already turned a blazing crimson, beautiful almost to the point of cruelty. Every report coming back was a disappointment. There were barely any houses left. Had the entire plan gone completely wrong? Arian speculated that it might have taken a form entirely beyond their imagination. Inside a room, Gunther vented his frustration at coming up empty. More than a dozen houses searched, and not even a mouse had been found. Then a strange dark shape suddenly darted past the window outside. Gunther's attention snapped to it and he gave chase without thinking. He barked a sharp command for it to stop, but he came to an abrupt halt the moment he saw what it was. It was not human in shape. It was a massive creature covered entirely in black fur. It slowly turned its head, revealing rows of white razor-sharp fangs. Before that night had fallen, Julius already knew everything. A shadow behind him was reporting the rumors about the undying knight. Julius immediately concluded that this had to be Bahar's doing. The shadow couldn't understand why he had been leaving Bahar for last. Julius's gaze went instantly cold, his voice completely devoid of warmth, simply because Bahar was where it all began, a place of profound significance. So he intended to savor it slowly, at the very end. But now it seemed the moment had come ahead of schedule. The shadow understood at once and dispatched Miranda. Julius added coldly that that person was to go as well. The undying knight was to be brought before him alive. The story turns back to that agonizing dusk when they were searching for Miranda. Reiner suddenly noticed an unusual sound coming from a residential building. His heart leapt, and he rushed over immediately, but he stopped dead in his tracks when he got close. He found Gunther walking toward him, carrying an enormous black bear on his back. Gunther asked whether bears could turn into vampires too. Reiner could only answer helplessly that it was probably unlikely. The bear was dropped on the ground, and an awkward silence settled over them. Arian reminded everyone that sunset was less than an hour away. Leonard suggested using the remaining time to do one more sweep, but Gunther was already frustrated. They didn't even know what the target looked like. Leonard proposed using fire to force the enemy out of hiding. Arian rejected the idea immediately, worried the fire would spread to the forest. They broke into an argument, and someone suggested giving up. Those words hit a nerve in Reiner, and he pushed back sharply. He absolutely could not accept giving up here. He had followed them precisely because he believed in their plan. He believed that only they could protect Bahar and keep it safe. He turned away with conviction, to go check one last time for anything they might have missed. Gunther couldn't understand why he was so worked up about it. Leonard explained, because Reiner's daughter lived in Bahar. She was the only thing he had left. Leonard said his piece and went back to searching. The light was fading fast, and inside the buildings almost nothing could be seen. Every possible hiding place had been checked, and Reiner's desperation was mounting. Staring at the last sliver of twilight through the window, despair nearly swallowed him whole. Then, from somewhere behind him came a very faint, strange sound. He spun around, his heart leaping straight to his throat. Behind a pile of battered old crates sat one that was relatively intact. The eerie sound seemed to be coming from inside it, but in that very moment, the light gave out entirely and darkness fell. The vampire's erupting power shattered the entire building in an instant. Reiner was hurled away by the shockwave and hit the ground hard. Arian and Gunther rushed to him as the enormous figure took shape before them. Gunther looked at the fully formed monster and let out a torrent of curses. Reiner struggled to his feet, his voice heavy with regret and anguish. He had found the enemy just moments ago. He had even had a chance to kill it. Gunther was furious and demanded to know why he hadn't acted. In Reiner's mind, the image inside the crate flashed back instantly. Curled up inside had been what looked unmistakably like a child. That one moment of hesitation had cost them the last chance. Now Miranda in its complete form had already raised its fist high and brought it crashing down toward them with the force of total annihilation. Gunther barely dodged the blow, his heart pounding with shock and fury. He demanded to know if Reiner had any other plan for fighting this thing. Hearing there was none, Gunther's rage boiled over and he shoved Reiner aside. But Miranda no longer paid them any attention and simply walked forward. Gunther was baffled, but Arian grasped the truth in an instant. The Iron Giant's gaze was locked on Bahar in the distance. Its one and only objective was to destroy the sanctuary. As Miranda moved, the soldiers in its path were as insignificant as ants. Enormous feet came down without mercy, snuffing out countless lives in an instant. Its eyes held only its target. The cries beneath its feet meant nothing to it. Gunther had already caught up to its side. He hefted a massive stone pillar and hurled it with everything he had. But a strike that took his full strength hit like a pebble against that skin. Refusing to accept it, he launched himself upward and poured every ounce of power into his fist. Was the skin really truly impenetrable? His fist hit far harder than the pillar and still accomplished nothing. He moved across the giant's body, his fists quickly becoming raw and bloodied, and yet Miranda's skin showed not the faintest mark. The giant grew impatient and began swatting at the insect on its body. Gunther dodged frantically through the gaps between those massive palms, each escape a close call. He was convinced that no matter how powerful a monster was, it had to have a weakness somewhere. That fatal flaw had to be exposed somewhere. The cupped hands came together again, and he barely slipped free once more. He slid rapidly along the smooth skin, searching for any opening. But in the next second, a hand closed around his leg. He was hoisted into the air, and found himself looking into those eyes that blazed like lighthouses. A jolt went through Gunther. A powerful instinct told him this was it. Those glowing eyes were in all likelihood the one and only weakness. But Miranda had no patience left, and the other hand flicked toward him. Gunther didn't even have time to react before he was reduced to ash in an instant. Far away, the queen stood on Bahar's walls, watching in silence. The Iron Giant had begun crossing the sea, yet the queen's expression was strangely calm. She declared that vampires were far from invincible. Ordinary people had defeated lesser vampires before. Even without that repulsive zombie knight, victory was still possible. The queen turned. Behind her stood an array of enormous weapons like a forest of steel. She couldn't help admiring their beauty, as noble as royal power itself. An attendant explained that they were fired by the tension of thousands of horses pulling together. Hundreds of giant bolts were powerful enough to pierce iron skin and reach the heart. Whatever the target, wherever it stood, it would be obliterated in an instant. The queen smiled. She was going to prove to everyone that the only true emperor and hero who could rule humanity would be her. She raised her hand high and gave the final command. In an instant, countless arrows tore through the air like a tide of death. At that moment, the others had finally traced the footprints the giant had left behind, but all that lay before them were scattered fragments. A scene so brutal it chilled the blood. Reiner stared hard at those charred pieces. Was this all that remained of everything they had fought for with their lives? Overwhelming remorse drowned him instantly, tears cutting through the ash and dust on his face. Arian felt as though she couldn't breathe. Then something suddenly rolled out from behind her. Everyone spun around in shock and saw that familiar head. Gunther's muffled voice came through, cursing and grumbling that he wasn't dead yet. Arian rushed over and scooped him up, joy and worry tangled together. Gunther clicked his tongue awkwardly, seeming unaccustomed to that kind of concern. They didn't dare waste a moment and set off with him for Bahar at full speed. In the cart, Gunther struggled to communicate what he had spotted. A critical detail. He kept murmuring the word eyes, his voice faint and indistinct. Reiner leaned in anxiously and told him to speak more clearly. He finally guessed that Gunther was saying the giant's eyes had no skin protecting them, but Arian raised the question, without destroying the heart, how could they win? Gunther forced out another sound with great effort. Reiner listened carefully, then went rigid with shock. He asked in disbelief, was Gunther saying they had to enter the body through the eyes? Arian was startled too, but immediately realized this was the only chance they had. Yet a new problem arose. How were they supposed to climb to that height? At that moment, a spine-chilling screech tore across the distant sky. Countless specially crafted giant bolts split the air, trailing fire as they hurtled toward the giant. These were the queen's final weapons. Their force was terrifying to behold. Thick smoke swallowed the giant in an instant. Everyone held their breath and waited. But when the smoke cleared, Miranda walked on without a single scratch. Soldiers on the walls reported back in horror that the weapons had been completely useless. An attendant asked frantically what the next step was. The queen's face twisted with fury. The veins on her clenched fists stood out sharply, rage and helplessness intertwined. Miranda had reached the walls. Its enormous shadow fell over all of Bahar. Chunks of debris began raining down on the city streets like hailstones. Reiner and Arian ran and dodged through the crumbling streets. Reiner was once again consumed by self-blame, hating himself for not being decisive enough. Then suddenly a familiar voice reached his ears. His daughter Audrey came running toward him, overcome with excitement. She was overjoyed to see her father safe and well, tears glinting in her eyes. But Reiner demanded to know why she hadn't followed the evacuation orders. Audrey laughed and said she had come specifically to deliver the knight's body. She also teased that all his worrying was why he'd gone bald. Gunther made a muffled sound, drawing Audrey's attention. She introduced herself with enthusiasm and eagerly reached out to shake his hand. Gunther looked down at what remained of his arm, just half of it. He turned his head away with disdain. Audrey only then noticed his condition and stumbled over a flustered apology. Arian cut her off and suggested getting Gunther's body and weapons fitted first. Audrey mentioned that this was the last upper body they had, then carefully set it down. But Reiner suddenly felt a sharp unease. The impact sounds were coming too close. In the next second, the wall beside them exploded apart. A red shadow swept through. Reiner watched helplessly as his daughter was struck. Under Miranda's rampage, the entire area was reduced to rubble. Audrey looked up in terror and found Reiner gripping her with everything he had. One hand was clutching a crumbling piece of rock, the other locked around her wrist. Reiner strained with everything he had to pull her up, but Audrey told him to save the zombie knight's last body instead. Reiner cut her off with a roar. His daughter meant more to him than anything in the world. Before he'd even finished, the rock he was gripping snapped, and they both plunged downward. At the last possible instant, a set of jaws clamped hard onto Reiner's arm. It was Gunther, nothing left but a head and one arm, holding fast to the rock face. He forced out the word body in a muffled grunt. Reiner couldn't make it out clearly, but his heart was flooded with gratitude, taking it as an act of selfless rescue. Meanwhile, Miranda was still rampaging across Bahar Island with devastating fury. Buildings toppled like children's blocks. Leonard directed everyone to flee. The queen appeared silently behind him. She asked how much longer the defense line could hold. Leonard admitted honestly that getting through the night would be difficult. The queen asked about the zombie night and was told Gunther and the others were preparing. She gave a cold laugh, dismissing it as pointless effort. Watching the people running in panic to escape, she thought it would be fine if they all died. That way, no one would ever be able to criticize or judge her again. That twisted fixation left Leonard shaken to his core. On the other side, the others were working to fit Gunther with a new body. Gunther looked at the pair of strange extra arms that had been attached, slightly puzzled. He reached out and patted Reiner's bald head. His palms stuck fast. Arian explained they were biomimetic weapons designed for climbing sheer, slippery surfaces. Reiner wasn't bothered. In fact, he thanked Gunther with genuine sincerity. He had never imagined that the cold, indifferent Gunther would save them. Gunther immediately denied it with icy bluntness, saying he had only saved his own body. He had no concern at all for what happened to anyone else. But Reiner believed that when fighting alongside everyone, Gunther must have felt something like happiness. That remark cut straight into Gunther. He replied with a cold laugh. What was happiness? And who exactly was everyone? The so-called parents who had abandoned a baby in a garbage dump, or the heartless spectators who had bet on his life and death for entertainment? There had never been anyone around him except people who wanted to kill him or bring him down, but he had survived survived anyway, stubbornly clinging to life until now. He was alive, and that was his revenge against everyone who had wished him dead. He would make them all watch as he became the last one standing. It was the first time Reiner had heard any of this, and a deep compassion stirred in him. He asked what Gunther hoped for beyond just surviving. Gunther answered with a cold, silent stare, and the air between them went stiff. Fortunately, a teammate announced at that moment that all connections were complete. Gunther pulled out the connection tube without hesitation and prepared to return to the battlefield. In the instant he turned to leave, Arian couldn't hold back and called out to him. Her eyes were full of worry. She ended up only saying that she hoped to see him again tomorrow. Gunther turned his head slightly and brushed it off with an insincere deflection. Yet somewhere in a corner of his heart, those words seemed to land, just barely. The figure striding toward Miranda moved with more resolve than ever before. The crowd had been driven into a desperate corner. Miranda's massive body cast a shadow of death over them. It looked down at them, examining them the way one examines insects. Then, a tiny figure began leaping at speed across its body. Miranda swung a massive hand to swat it away, and closed on nothing but air. Gunther moved with agility, using his new arms to grip the monster's surface without slipping. His target was fixed on those lethal eyes. Just one more move, and he would reach the blind spot directly behind them. But the sky-blotting hand came thundering down again. Gunther was slammed into the ground like a meteor. He cratered deep into the earth. He climbed out to find yet another arm twisted and wrecked, but he didn't hesitate. He launched himself again at the giant, like an arrow from a bow. Every onlooker was stunned into silence, unable to comprehend this fearless charge toward death. Gunther cut through the ruins and along the walls, searching for a way to get close. Miranda tore through everything in its path with violent abandon. Rubble rained down, and Gunther leaped and weaved through the lethal gaps. Finally, he seized the moment again and vaulted onto that towering body. He pressed close to the skin and climbed. Miranda's great hand swept toward him. He barely dodged and kept climbing. At last, he managed to hide himself behind the monster's clenched fist. Enraged, Miranda did something completely reckless. It swung that fist and drove it into the ground with all its force. The impact shook the earth and brought buildings down. But when Miranda lifted its fist, Gunther was still clinging to the back of its hand. In that moment, he caught a glimpse of something through the crater it had punched out. Beneath the island was a hidden underground space, deep and vast. No time to think about it. Miranda had already flung him hard toward the ground. Then that devastating fist followed right after. Far away, the hearts of Arian and Reiner nearly stopped. As the dust settled, Gunther had lost half a leg, but he seemed to feel no pain. He pressed up on both arms and moved through the rubble at a startling speed. Miranda's fist came down again and again, turning the ground to powder. Yet every time, at the very last instant, he managed to get clear. Gunther kept his eyes locked on the monsters, calculating his final opportunity. He gathered every last scrap of strength and shot upward like a bolt of lightning. This time, he landed precisely on Miranda's broad back. Just one more. He only needed to divert its attention one final time. Miranda sensed something wrong on its back and slowly raised its arm, but its movement suddenly stalled, its gaze drawn to something in the distance. Gunther saw his chance. Now, he drove off with every last bit of strength in his body. His figure arced over Miranda's head like an arrow. Every ounce of fury, clarity, and power converged into his fist. Miranda finally panicked. Deep in Miranda's memory was a worn and tattered rag doll. It had belonged to his little sister. He remembered watching his sister be hurt and being unable to move, paralyzed by fear of the aggressor's power. At the very moment he hated himself most, Julius had appeared like a savior. The vampire made him a promise that together they would build a new world without monsters. Miranda had looked up, his eyes uncertain at first, and then giving way to complete and total trust. Now he had truly gained the overwhelming power he had once dreamed of. But when he saw two children not far away, he froze. A sister was desperately trying to shield her little brother. In the children's terrified eyes, he saw a grotesque reflection of himself. In that moment, the truth crashed over him. He had become the very monster he had once hated most. A moment of confusion and hesitation was all Gunther needed. He seized it and drove himself like an arrow straight into the giant's eye. Miranda scrambled to block with its hand, but was a step too late. Under the wide-eyed gaze of the children, that massive body began to crumble and dissolve. Gunther landed hard, propped up by a crutch, with only one hand and one foot left. He dragged his broken body through the streets, drawing sideways glances of shock and wariness from passers-by. Whispers followed him, wondering aloud whether he too counted as a monster. He tuned it all out, until a young, small voice called after him. It was the little girl he had saved. She said her thanks out loud, thanking him for letting them keep living. Gunther asked coldly what that had to do with him, and turned to leave. A louder thank you came from behind him, making his step falter, barely noticeably. He didn't turn around in the end, only let out a proud, dismissive snort through his nose. Back at the base, Audrey's amazement hit him like a wave the moment he walked in. She called him a born warrior, and even talked about having a statue made of him. Reiner had to step in and ask her to stop going so overboard. Then Arian placed a hand on Gunther's shoulder. She said quietly that being able to see him return safely, it really meant everything. Gunther looked back at her and said she had the same expression as always, always, so he couldn't tell at all. Arian heard that and made a real effort to pull together a smile to show her joy, but it came out stiff and forced, and Gunther felt a cold sweat break out. Before the moment could settle, the queen's presence arrived with an icy chill. She opened by apologizing for interrupting the celebration, in a tone with no apology in it whatsoever. Then she pivoted coldly and began tallying up the enormous losses of the engagement. She credited herself with evacuating the civilians, but for everything else that had been lost, someone had to be held responsible. Her gaze cut like a blade, landing directly on Commander Reiner. She accused him of failing to kill Miranda in time and declared he should face a public execution. Audrey went pale in an instant and begged for her soft-hearted father. The queen only refused in cold indifference, insisting someone had to bear the blame. Gunther, who had been silent until now, finally reached his limit and muttered "madwoman" under his breath. He stated plainly that while Reiner was a coward, it was the queen whose poor decisions had squandered the troops. He pulled the connector from the back of his neck and stepped up to her face, demanding to know why she refused to admit her own mistakes even now. The queen's brow tightened as she asked what exactly he wanted. The temperature in the room dropped to nothing. At that moment, an unfamiliar, unhurried voice drifted in from nowhere. It mocked the queen for still playing petty royal games unworthy of her station. Both Gunther and the queen turned in startled unison. In the next second, cold light flashed, and Gunther's head was severed. The newcomer caught the head with elegance and introduced himself as the king's younger brother. His name was Belbrick, one who could become king. He said with casual indifference that he and Julius had an agreement long in place. The purpose of his visit was precisely to bring this zombie knight back with him. The soldiers' blades had not yet fallen. Belbrick's blood edge had already cut through the air. 2 soldiers dropped instantly. The rest were frozen by the force of his overwhelming power. He held Gunther's head up and asked whether it was worth laying down their lives for it. The knights exchanged glances, eyes filled with fear and hesitation. In the end, the instinct to survive made them quietly step aside. The queen's voice rose at that moment. She mocked her uncle for ultimately becoming a true monster himself. Belbrick simply asked in return whether she intended to block his path for that head. The crushing weight of his presence made it hard to breathe. She stared at him in silence and finally stepped aside with visible humiliation, clearing the way. But as he walked past, cutting words came back like arrows. He mocked her for having footsteps too loud, unworthy of true royal grace. The remark landed precisely on her deepest wound, and she shook with rage. Belbrick carried Gunther and walked without hurry down the center of the street. Gunther burned with fury but had no strength to struggle. The residents watched in fear from all sides, not one daring to step forward. Reiner came rushing after them in desperation, knowing that once a vampire entered the forest, there would be no more chances. Audrey couldn't understand why he wasn't running. Running would be so much faster. Belbrick answered in an unbothered tone that true royalty never ran. The helplessness Gunther felt being carried was both absurd and profound. At the end of the bridge, a furious shout blocked the way. Gunther looked up and was stunned to find it was Leonard standing in their path. Belbrick asked again whether he was prepared to sacrifice himself for that head. Leonard's answer was absolute. Without a single moment of hesitation, he believed that head was the hope of humanity's future. Belbrick let out a quiet, contemptuous laugh. He said that humans only ever hurt each other and stopped at nothing for self-interest. He challenged Leonard on whether sacrificing himself for such a species was truly worth it. Leonard lowered his head. The question held him in brief silence, but he raised it again, with an unshakable conviction burning in his eyes. He believed in the goodness of humanity, in the light of human nature, even in the darkest depths. He believed that those who healed the wounds were also human. Then footsteps rose behind him as more people stepped forward. They refused to stand by and watch humanity become pitiful monsters at humanity's own hands. Belbrick closed his eyes as if listening to a farcical speech. Then he scoffed that only 5 people held such naive convictions. How could a mere 5 people stand in his way? Leonard gripped his weapon and said they would find out when they tried, because Gunther had once saved them, and now it was their turn to return the favor. With those words, they charged. 5 figures, like fragile moths throwing themselves at a raging flame, before they moved onto the bridge to block the vampire. Leonard turned and offered a solemn word of thanks to every soldier behind him. The soldiers pushed down their fear and said they weren't afraid of dying, only afraid of dying for nothing. Leonard was silent for a moment, then gave a reply of absolute certainty. He said their names might never be sung in great epics, because they were not great generals, nor kings chosen by fate, but every small act of resistance and courage, if it accumulated, would become a real force capable of shaking destiny itself. This was absolutely not without meaning. Their very act of fighting was the meaning. The soldiers smiled, the tension leaving them, determination reigniting in their eyes, but those smiles were quickly twisted by pain, swallowed into the red. The clash with Belbrick was brief and brutal. The difference in strength was vast. Leonard lost his right arm. Belbrick looked down at the defeated with an expression that held a trace of genuine admiration. He said they had shown praiseworthy courage, so he would spare their lives, as an act of royal mercy. With that, he turned with composure and continued toward the forest. The dense trees that would block out the sunlight were only a short stretch away. Just as he was about to step into the shade, another voice stopped him. Belbrick turned with patience, and saw Arian standing alone, sword in hand. hand. He asked whether she too wished to join this fight. Arian's answer was absolute. Without a trace of hesitation, Belbrick reminded her that mercy could only be given once. If she chose to fight, he would show no restraint this time. Arian didn't waver in the slightest, and she spoke what was in her heart. That man who had fought alone his entire life, she wanted to save him. Those direct, unguarded words stirred something in Belbrick's eyes. He murmured quietly that it was quite the blush-inducing line. Arian realized only after the fact, and felt her own cheeks warm slightly. Belbrick slowly raised his sword, saying he had taken note of her resolve. In that case, he would bring it down without mercy. Arian braced and blocked the first strike, her arms going numb from the impact. But the expected second blow never came. In its place was a wave of heat. The very first ray of dawn had finally pierced through the darkness and spilled across the earth. Sunlight burned across the vampire's arm. Belbrick retreated swiftly into the shadow of the nearest large tree. He looked at the dense forest only 50 paces away, his expression unreadable. A distance that short, yet now it had become an insurmountable gulf. Before long, the queen arrived with her attendants. The corner of her mouth curved as she let out a soft, deeply mocking sigh. She taunted that the uncle who had once been so high and mighty now found himself in such a sorry state. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows he could hide in grew smaller. The queen asked why he hadn't prepared a retinue of lesser vampire servants, then feigned a moment of realization, mocking that dethroned royalty had no one left to follow them. Belbrick acknowledged the point calmly, all thanks to her father's exile of him. But his bearing remained proud, and he asked the queen in return what she intended to do with him now. The queen considered it with visible pleasure, slowly cut down the tree, or simply set it on fire. Belbrick then raised the point that neither would befit the glorious standards of royalty. He claimed he could have fled, but had chosen to stay to preserve his honor. Being trapped here was proof that he upheld the royal code, and if the queen used that against him to kill him, it would be a dishonorable act, not a choice worthy of someone of royal blood. Arian immediately warned the queen not to be taken in by his sophistry. His ability to stand here at all had been bought by the soldiers with their lives. Belbrick continued to put forward what he called his proposal of honor. He asked the queen whether she wished to hear it. The queen began to consider, and the only sound left around them was the rustling of leaves in the wind. After a long moment, she suddenly gave a soft, quiet, meaningful laugh. The queen's memories were filled with her uncle's cold, cutting reproaches. That voice had always told her she was a disappointment, unworthy of the throne. Even the smallest slip in dining etiquette would be magnified into a grave offense. He had declared her foolish, completely unsuited to be of royal blood. Those words had become thorns lodged deep inside her, and years later she still despised him for them. The attendant asked urgently whether she had accepted the dangerous proposal. The queen answered with firm resolve, evading an honorable duel was a disgrace. She would seize this opportunity to prove that she was the true royalty. She then turned on the attendant Patrick, demanding to know where he had disappeared to just now. Patrick looked a little guilty. He claimed he had been searching for an escape route on her behalf. The queen saw through him at once, exposing that he had actually been finding a way out for himself. She warned him that if he dared to vanish without permission again, the consequences would be severe. She would have his limbs cut off to remind him who was in command. Patrick could only bow with a pained smile and say he would take it to heart. On the other side, Audrey found the queen's decision completely incomprehensible. She couldn't understand what could possibly matter more than the chance the knights had bought with their lives. Arian felt equally helpless, but knew they had no choice but to comply. Reiner was more concerned with what kind of duel this was actually going to be. The dueling ground was quickly set up around the tree, the atmosphere grim. The first challenger stepped forward and announced his name with confidence. He was certain he could beat a vampire with his bare fists. Arian explained to the others that this was the noble honor fist duel. Each side would take turns landing a punch to the other's face, with no dodging permitted. If either contestant's feet moved even the slightest fraction, they would be declared the loser. Audrey felt the rules were absurd for something that decided life and death. Reiner still clung to a thread of hope, praying their side would win. Arian analyzed the situation. The other side only had one person, so they just needed to win once. 4 chances to win 1. There seemed to be some hope yet. Baron Byron charged in amid the cheering, already imagining the glory and riches of victory. His fist slammed hard into Belbrick's face. The impact contorted the vampire's features grotesquely. The force was terrifying, yet Belbrick's feet were planted as if rooted to the ground, completely unmoved. When it came time for Belbrick to strike back, Baron Byron was visibly frightened. Belbrick swung back with a casual, almost lazy punch. The Baron's head deformed like a balloon, and his whole body was sent flying. He hit the ground and lay still, gone. The entire crowd fell into dead silence. Patrick moved to say something to the queen, but she was calm. She had anticipated this outcome and was already looking forward to the next challenger. The second duelist stepped up. He introduced himself as an undefeated champion of honorable dueling, radiating confidence. Even Belbrick acknowledged he looked stronger. This powerfully built man knew the secret. A duel wasn't won by brute force alone. He aimed for the vampire's most vulnerable point, the temple, and struck with everything he had. The heavy blow landed precisely, and Belbrick's eyes instantly rolled back. His body rocked violently as though he might finally be about to give way. Audrey watched with eyes wide, her heart nearly leaping from her throat. Belbrick's upper body bent backward at an inhuman angle, but since his feet hadn't moved, the referee could not call him the loser. Then it was Belbrick's turn again. Before anyone could react, Belbrick's fist had already swung. His attacker was likewise sent flying, his life snuffed out in an instant. The third representative took the stage. He fancied himself a strategist of the intellectual variety. He declared that through careful observation he had identified Belbrick's weakness. He wore a smile of absolute certainty, as though the outcome were already decided. But his end was no different. That face crumpled under the impact. Arian and the others fell into a long, speechless silence. Audrey couldn't understand why such a brutal duel was even taking place. Arian felt just as powerless inside, but there was no way back now. Every remaining hope rested entirely on the final representative. Upon learning the last person was Gunther, Belbrick objected immediately. He declared that head already belonged to him, but the queen only gave a cold smile and had Gunther's complete body brought out. She pointed out that what the other side possessed was far less than what she had, and she gave her royal word that if they lost, the head would be handed over willingly. She finished with a light-pointed question. Was he perhaps afraid to duel and looking to back out? That dishonorable label left Belbrick with no choice but to concede. The moment his body and head were reconnected, Gunther's first words were a stream of curses. He found the entire concept of this killing game, played in the name of honor, utterly senseless. The queen dismissed him with contempt, saying it was natural for the lowly to fail to grasp noble conduct. She promised that if they won honorably, Reiner's charges would be dropped. Then she set the duel for the bridge after sunset and turned to leave. Gunther flexed his new arm, feeling a deep and unsettling wrongness about it. Arian explained it had been specially crafted to deliver the most powerful punch possible. Due to the time constraints, parts from Leonard and others had been incorporated into it. Gunther felt a wave of revulsion at that. Arian quietly asked whether he found that sacrifice moving. Gunther paused for just a moment, then gave a firm denial. Night fell, and the final duel unfolded on the ancient bridge. Belbrick was inwardly elated. Everything was going exactly according to his plan. He had been laughing at the queen's foolishness all along, and had rigged the outcome long ago. He had quietly manipulated the joints in his feet so they could detach at will. Even if his upper body were knocked flying, his feet would never move. Whether it was dishonorable or not meant nothing to him. He only wanted to watch the queen suffer a humiliating defeat. The referee announced that Gunther's side would strike first. Gunther gathered every ounce of his strength and threw an earth-shattering punch. In the split second before it connected, Belbrick's smile locked in place. A force far beyond anything he had anticipated, annihilating in scale, came rushing at him. Belbrick's head separated instantly from his body and rolled across the ground. Gunther assumed the fight was over, but the referee ruled that since the other side's feet hadn't moved, the match had to continue. Gunther couldn't hold back his curses. These dueling rules were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Belbrick's body began to reassemble. A flicker of genuine alarm passed through him, quickly replaced by even stronger confidence. He was certain that once it was his turn to attack, it would all be over. But Gunther's jaw had been urgently reinforced to withstand the impact. Belbrick's fist failed to cave his face in, and Gunther's feet held firm as though they had taken root. The referee announced again. Gunther had not moved an inch. Attack and defense were swapped. Gunther's counter came, and another heavy punch drove forward. Belbrick's head flew off once more, and his heels lifted, barely. He stamped back down in a panic, and for the first time a real sense of crisis rose within him. If this kept up, he might genuinely lose the fight. He raged out of control, declaring that he alone had the right to call himself king. Only he was the bloodline truly fit to sit upon the throne. Gunther spat out a broken piece from his mouth and asked coldly what of it. Belbrick completely erupted, tearing open an old wound that had festered for years. He accused the queen's father of not only stealing the throne that was rightfully his, but also having his arms cut off to eliminate forever any chance of him claiming the crown. He spread open those countless strange arms formed from his blood. Gunther felt a wave of nausea. This family really was entirely unhinged. Belbrick swore he would prove that a pretender could never beat him. His attack came again, but this time Gunther ducked. Belbrick froze. That was against the rules. In the next second, Gunther had already seized him from behind and hurled him away with force. Arian, watching from the side, was left speechless. Even the queen's expression went to one of disbelief. Belbrick, wounded and seething with shame, accused it of being a dishonorable act. Gunther only found it laughable. He had run out of patience and had no interest in playing along with this tedious game of honor. Belbrick tried to draw his blood together into arms once more but failed. He realized in horror that the attack just now might have damaged his heart. A vampire with an incomplete heart could not control blood. Gunther's hand was already around his throat like an iron clamp, declaring that the real fight was only beginning now. Belbrick sensed death closing in and frantically tried to negotiate, but Gunther's eyes showed not a single ripple. One final punch brought an end to all the noise and resentment. The queen was furious over Gunther's decision to dodge. She condemned it as a desecration of the highest honor of both royalty and the duel itself. Attempting Attendant Patrick finally snapped and spoke up to stop her. He insisted that what he had witnessed was Gunther holding firm against the attack and landing a fourth punch after the third round, knocking the vampire down. He turned to the other nobles and sought their agreement. The nobles hesitated for a moment, then one by one nodded their assent. Patrick immediately pressured the record keeper to change the account accordingly. The record keeper, trembling, changed dodge to held firm. Patrick turned to the queen and declared that this was the full account of events. The queen felt a flicker of unease at first, but it was instantly swamped by elation. The entire court erupted in a loud and hollow cry of "Long live." Arian and Audrey watched the absurd farce with cold, detached eyes. Back on the real battlefield, Gunther's fists had not stopped. Belbrick kept wailing and begging for mercy under the beating. He demanded to know how much longer this one-sided pummeling was going to last. Gunther grinned and said he'd keep going until the sun came up. Belbrick made another offer. He claimed to know the hiding place of the last pure-blood vampire. If his life were spared, he would take them to Julius. That would save humanity a great deal of fighting and lead directly to victory. Gunther wasn't convinced. After all, if Julius died, Belbrick would die too. But Belbrick brought up the binding power of the vampire contract. He was obligated to bring the zombie knight before his master. The manner in which that was done didn't matter. Gunther found the offer tempting, but decided to throw a few more punches before giving it any thought. Belbrick's curses were swallowed once more by the fist that came for him, until dawn broke. Belbrick was bound in heavy chains. Arian came to interrogate him, deeply skeptical of the deal he was proposing. They had no grounds on which to trust a vampire. At the same time, she had noticed a deeper contradiction. Even if the contract mattered to him, Julius's death meant his death too. She looked him directly in the eye and posed the most critical question. What had his real purpose been when he chose to become a vampire in the first place? Belbrick only smiled with an air of mystery and declined to answer. But before Gunther could lose his temper, he quickly promised he would honor the agreement. Afterward, Arian and Gunther discussed the dangerous proposition. If they could reach Julius, the situation would swing heavily in their favor. Then Arian suddenly felt something warm and wet. She raised her hand to wipe it. It was a nosebleed, streaked with black. Gunther was still walking ahead of her, talking about ending the war. Then he suddenly felt the connection cut out. He spun around in shock and found Arian collapsed on the ground. He called her name urgently but got no response. Everyone fell into a panic. Her temperature was alarmingly high, and her breathing was extremely faint. To help her breathe more easily, they scrambled to loosen her clothing. The moment Gunther saw her body, he went rigid where he stood. Her slender back was covered in dark, angry bruises and raised, twisting veins. Reiner said this was the final stage of a power host's condition. To absorb and control the endless erosion of the drugs, her body had been transformed. Her internal organs had been warped as a result, making it impossible to digest even ordinary food. Gunther was shaken to his core, unable to imagine how she had been living in that body, especially since she had used it to endure countless nights of battle by his side. Reiner said there was no precedent to follow. They could only watch and wait. But he realized with surprise that Gunther was actually worried about whether Arian would live or die. Gunther snapped in irritation that he was only afraid of losing his power source. Reiner gave him a knowing look and said nothing more. A teammate reported her breathing was stable, but the cause of her condition remained a mystery. Worse still, even with Gunther connected to her right now, the power couldn't fill up. Reiner explained that the worse her physical state became, the lower the power output. It was already fortunate that things weren't getting worse. He even warned that if her condition deteriorated further, the power would begin draining away even while connected. Gunther felt a despair settle over him. This was more terrifying than dying in battle. Reiner told him to stay by the bedside and keep watch, while he went to look for another way. The room was left with just the two of them. Gunther looked at his remaining time, less than 1 hour. Arian was still running a high fever. He wrung out a cloth and clumsily wiped the sweat from her face. Only in that moment did he notice how small her face and hands actually were. Why should such a slight body have to endure the agony of being torn apart? He couldn't understand what it was that made her willing to sacrifice herself like this. Audrey burst in at that moment and walked straight into the sight of him holding her hand. She went red in an instant, dropped the bucket, and fled in flustered haste. After the door shut, her excited exclamations followed. He bellowed in mortified outrage, the sound reverberating around the room. Night came, and there was still no sign of Arian waking. As Gunther wiped the sweat from her face, he found himself thinking about what she had said before the battle. She had said it with such sincerity that she hoped to see him again tomorrow. Without realizing it, he pressed his hands together and repeated that same prayer, hoping that tomorrow he would still be able to see her. But when dawn arrived, his prayer went unanswered. Gunther was on the edge of breaking down, and worse still, the power connected at his wrist had begun to decrease. Reiner announced with a grave expression that they could not wait any longer. They had to activate the final plan. They could no longer depend on Arian as the sole power host. Before the power was completely depleted, they had to mobilize every available person to develop new power humans who could replace her. Arian was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. Gunther stayed close by her side. As they passed through the corridor, a massive stone stele stood in the shadows. Its surface was carved densely with names. Reiner explained that these were all the people who had failed the Power Human project. Gunther hadn't expected the names of heroes to be buried in a place like this. Reiner gave a bitter smile. Their path had never been understood by the world. Then a teammate came running with a report. Materials for one person had been prepared. When Gunther heard one person, despair seized him again. Reiner explained that all resources were only enough to create one miracle. Gunther found himself curious as to which fool would willingly sacrifice themselves this time. Reiner's expression suddenly turned deadly serious. He began to speak honestly about himself, that he had always been too indecisive his whole life. But this time, he could no longer run away. He had to protect Audrey. He looked at Gunther with eyes that burned and stated his decision. This time, he would be the Power Human so that Gunther could live. Gunther never imagined for a moment it would be the once cowardly, life-clinging Reiner. Before long, Reiner sat down on the operating table. He explained the process would be quick. If it worked, Gunther's power would be restored. Gunther asked what would happen if it failed, but Reiner stubbornly insisted it would succeed. Just before being wheeled into the operating room, his only request was to keep it from Audrey. Before long, Reiner was wheeled back out after the first stage. His entire body was covered in raised, bulging veins and trembling beyond his control. Gunther pressed him anxiously for how he was feeling, his heart in his throat. Reiner admitted it was far from pleasant, but said it was a good start, because the success rate of the first stage had been less than 50% to begin with. Gunther looked at the light that had nearly gone out, and knew they were down to the last of the time. Reiner forced himself upright, and said there were things he had to say right now. Gunther wanted to refuse to listen to anything that sounded like final words, but Reiner went ahead anyway. Audrey was not his biological daughter. Gunther stared with an expression of disbelief. Reiner spoke of the past. He had been betrayed by someone he had treated like a brother. Losing everything, he ended up on the streets, waiting to die in despair. It was a small, dirty little girl who split half a piece of bread with him. Those tiny hands and that clear, open gaze became his entire world. He was grateful to the parents who had abandoned Audrey. They had made him a father. In this brutal, merciless world, it was Audrey who had saved him. He looked at Gunther and said sincerely that he hoped Gunther would find someone like that too. Someone who could heal all the wounds that humanity had ever inflicted on him. Gunther was silent. Those words fell heavily on his heart. A teammate urged that the second stage was about to begin, and Reiner nodded with calm composure. He was wheeled once more toward that plain but fate-deciding operating room. Gunther stood where he was for a long time, unable to move. At that moment, Audrey, who had been gazing out the window, felt a sudden pang and turned, as though sensing that someone dear to her was stepping into the furnace of life. Gunther went back to Arian's side and connected the device one last time. He repeated silently to himself that surviving was more meaningful than anything else. He hadn't even finished the thought that had always carried him forward, when the harsh alarm tore through the air and the red light went out completely. All the power was gone. His support gave out, and his consciousness sank into boundless darkness. A new name was added to the cold stone stele, the name Reiner, clear and deeply carved. He had sustained himself for a full 12 days after becoming a power human. It was recorded as a failed experiment, yet it was also a miracle of life. Perhaps what sustained him was a will beyond anything ordinary people could imagine. Throughout that time, Arian remained lost in unconsciousness. But another miracle came on the 11th night. She finally woke, and although her body was weak, she soon began to transfer power again. Yet Reiner's condition deteriorated sharply the moment she came back to them. Perhaps because he had finally been able to let go, he allowed himself to reach the end. In his final moments, he murmured quietly that he had never known living could be so painful. But in a world this cruel and harsh, to have had hope at all was already a gift. Audrey gripped his hand tightly, forcing out a smile with everything she had. In his last breaths, warm memories from the past drifted before his eyes, roasting meat together in a mountain cave. Quiet, ordinary days in their new home. Her laughing as she polished his bald head until it shone. The first time she brought a boy home. Tears finally slid from the corner of his eye as he murmured to himself, his daughter, how beautiful she was. With those words, he closed his eyes forever. Audrey did not cry in front of him. She said it had been his choice, and it was he who had been everyone's support. If it had been her, she would have made the same decision. But after that, deep into every night, from that small room, there always came the sound of quiet, suppressed, persistent weeping. At dusk, Gunther was receiving energy from Arian. They were talking about the journey that would set out the following day. Arian looked through her documents, focused and composed. Gunther found himself marveling that after everything she had been through, life, death, and loss, she was carrying herself with a calm that went beyond what he would have imagined. Arian closed the book quietly. She said plainly that without this kind of resolve, none of it would have ever begun. Gunther gave a soft, deflecting laugh and looked away. He said under his breath that he was actually really glad to see her again. Just don't go collapsing on him like that again next time. Arian heard him and gave him a warm, gentle smile. That night, Arian fell into a deep sleep, and Gunther kept watch by her bedside. An unusual sound put him instantly on alert. When the door was pushed open, his blade was already at the intruder's throat. The visitor turned out to be the Queen's attendant, Patrick. He claimed the visit had nothing to do with the Queen and was purely a personal call. hall. He offered his condolences for Reiner's passing, though his tone gave nothing away. Gunther looked at him coldly and pointed out he was an entirely different person from when he was at the Queen's side. Patrick took that as a kind of compliment and smiled. Then he stated his purpose. Someone urgently wanted to see him before the expedition departed. Gunther moved to wake Arian, but was stopped immediately. Patrick made clear he had to go alone. Gunther asked warily, without a connection, he only had 2 hours. Patrick said the one who wanted to see him was a presence more important than the fate of humanity, the King of Kings, the very origin of human history itself. Wasn't he curious about the true origins of humans and vampires? If he came along, every answer would be revealed. Patrick's words were full of temptation, like the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Gunther stared hard at him, every alarm in his mind ringing at full pitch.